Back in my ninth grade year, I had unwillingly befriended someone I really wish I had avoided. Let me start this off with some background information. I don't know if it's like this for all schools, but basically, we're assigned a school based on what zone we live in. During my middle school years, we moved, and I was meant to change schools, but I was given the chance to stay as long as I went to the proper high school later. The time came, and I went to the correct high school while everyone I knew went to the other. I was pretty much the new girl in town. I had tried out for these special scientific classes, and I finally made it in. One of the big things for this class was team building, so it was pretty much tradition that every year there was a mini camping trip to get to know our peers. I remember very well that everyone had already known each other since they had come from the same school. When the trip day arrived, my classmates scrambled onto the bus and I hung back a bit. By the time I worked up the courage to enter, there was only one more seat available that everyone had avoided. Looking back now, I realized it was because of him. I sat down, and there was a boy there. He was short and thin, totally non-threatening looking. He seemed relieved that someone had sat next to him, but said nothing for a long while. An hour later, he had finally decided to try and talk with me. It was small talk, slightly forced on my end, simply because talking to new people makes me uncomfortable. Eventually, we moved on to play Never Have I Ever. At first it was fun, but with each question it got more and more personal. The game ended, and we sat mostly in silence until I fell asleep. When I woke up, I realized he had rested his head on my shoulder. Naturally, I pushed him off, and nothing more was said. Sometime later, we got off and were at the camp. I began to notice that he'd follow me. If I did any camp activities, he was by my side at all times. It was difficult for me to make friends with this weird guy following me around everywhere. I had finally connected with a few of the girls, though, and I stuck mostly by them. One event that struck odd with me was when we went swimming in the lake. We wanted to go in to shower afterwards, but he wanted to come with me too. We told him not to, and as we walked, he trailed along behind us. We actually began pleading for him to just go away. It took a teacher to catch on to our conversation for him to finally leave us alone. After the trip, only a few things stuck out on his creepy mannerisms. He clung to our group of girls, and despite our annoyance, we didn't want to be cruel and send away someone who was clearly mentally troubled. I remember one time I was inviting them over for a sleepover, and he was angry that he wasn't invited to come, stating that I was sexist. In fact, whenever I showed any interest to another guy, that was always his go-to insult. He would purposely try to ruin possible relationships for me. He was also heavily jealous of my brother. My brother, seriously. One event was the last straw. It was the morning time before class started, so I waited in the cafeteria with some friends. He came up to me with a lot of purpose in his step and asked me to come with him somewhere. I don't know where to, but I didn't want to go with him and flat out refused. His response? He marched around the table for 5 minutes. No pauses, nothing. It literally took another student to tell him to leave me alone. That student then told me he had done it to her too. I was shocked, honestly. She told me it would only get worse if I didn't stop him right now, so that's what I did. I told him to leave me alone, and that if he didn't I would report him for harassment. And then it was over. But at the same time, it wasn't. I don't recall any creepy behavior happening in 10th grade, but then this year marched in. I was kicked out of the special science class after having a nervous breakdown and failing math, and placed in a CP Algebra 2 class. I walked in, and who do I see? Him, of course. He stares at me and smiles. I sat down a few rows away, close to the front, and I can feel his stare on my back. The first week passes with no problem. He interjects in class a lot, and corrects the teacher, but nothing to me. Then I heard him talking to himself, whispering. When called out by another student, they joked, and all was well, it seemed. He said something else that was inaudible to me. I was later told it was a school shooting joke, and then he said a little louder, intended for me to hear, that he was going to get his revenge on the people who had wronged him. I didn't report him. I was hoping I had heard him wrong. Somebody else did, though. He was suspended for a week and moved out of my math class. When he came back, he watched me and my boyfriend. Told anyone who would listen that I was fake or that he opened me up to people. I later found out he openly blamed me for his suspension, and the staring still continues. In fact, I caught him today and yesterday doing it. This happened when I was about 13 years old, and I still think about it today. My friend Jackie and I were extremely mischievous children. We loved joking around, sometimes using extreme measures to pull the best pranks. I can remember climbing a neighbor's tree with her and devising a rope and pulley system with a basket and water balloons to get the balloons on the top of the tree. We would throw them at the neighborhood boys without being detected or retaliated against. Sometimes we would do mildly dangerous things to get a good rush, but it was never serious, just harmless messing around. One night, Jackie came over for a sleepover. We ate a bunch of candy and talked about boys, and then we got bored. It was around 1 a.m, and we were hyped off the sugar so we couldn't sleep. One of us mentioned that we wished our other friend, Bailey, was there to hang out with. And then I got the most brilliant idea of the evening. The two of us should sneak out of my house, walk over to Bailey's, and then TP her front tree. Now, for those of you who don't know what TPing is, it means toilet papering. You know how the douchey frat boys in college sometimes throw toilet paper all over other fraternity houses to show dominance or something? And that's what I wanted to do. She, of course, thought it was a brilliant idea. So we stuffed a bunch of rolls of toilet paper into 2 large purses, put on some sneakers, and then sneaked downstairs and out my back door. It was a summer night, so not too cold, which was good, because we were wearing tank tops and PJ shorts. The walk to her house was half through neighborhoods, and half through a long stretch of road next to a golf course, with a neighborhood at the very end of it. Bailey's house was a little under a mile away, so we began hustling so that we could get there faster, and maybe tap on her window to get her to hang out if she wasn't asleep. We began walking, at first nervous that my parents would catch us, and then confident that they wouldn't. We began giggling and talking about boys again. Now, I'm sure that most people reading this will think we were very stupid, and we were, but you have to understand the context of the situation. My hometown is very quiet. Nobody goes outside after 8 o'clock at night. It was ranked in the top 5 safest cities in the United States. Nothing bad ever happens there, or at least nothing that we knew about at that age. We had up until that point thankfully never had the opportunity to be afraid of walking alone, or at night growing up. So with that in mind, we figured we had nothing to worry about. We kept chattering as we crossed the residential area into the golf course, and didn't miss a beat in doing so. Suddenly, an SUV lazily rode up going the opposite way of us. I can still remember it like it happened a few minutes ago instead of years. The SUV was large, red and 4-doored, with a middle-aged man driving. He slowed down as he approached us and rolled down his windows. "Hey, girlies. What are you doing up so late at night?" He had a huge mouth with perfect straight white teeth, and he would have been handsome if he hadn't been so strange. "Nothing?" He raised his eyebrows at that. "Nothing? All by yourselves? Well, that's pretty dangerous." He smiled again, and this time even wider, and I could for the first time in my life feel fear ripple through me like a wave. "We're walking to my dad's house. He's waiting for us." Silence crept between the car and us. I had lied, and he knew it. He looked at me and then at Jackie. For a minute, I actually convinced myself that maybe he was just a very, very creepy, nosy neighbor. but there was something so wrong with him. He took his time replying, twisting the words around in his mouth like he was tying a cherry stem into a knot. "That's interesting. You're so young to be out so late and wearing that. You better hurry home to him before it's too late." The air stood still. The only thing keeping me from bolting was Jackie by my side. I couldn't see her face because I was locking eyes with the smiling man, so I wasn't sure if she had heard what I heard too. Too late? Too late at night, or too late for what? I didn't want to know, and I was certain that if he were somehow separated, things would go very, very badly. I thought quickly. He was on the other side of the road. He would have to go a distance to get to us. I tore my eyes from his and risked a quick glance at Jackie, and Jackie wasn't moving either. She was looking at me with wide eyes as if I would somehow know what to do, so I pretended that I did. "Thank you, sir. Have a good night." I grabbed Jackie's hand and marched down the sideway away from him in what I hoped was a confident way. His SUV lingered behind us, unmoving. We kept walking, gripping hands covered in sweat together, as if it was the only thing keeping us from certain death. Our footsteps made empty, hollow noises down the deserted sidewalk. My ears were in sonar mode, listening for something, anything. A car door opening, a man's voice. But I refused to turn around and give him the satisfaction of knowing I was afraid. I didn't want him to know that we were. Suddenly a car screeched into gear, and we heard him peel down the asphalt. We started running, and as we ran, we both looked behind our shoulders. He had driven off in the opposite way, away from us. We didn't slow down, though. Eventually we could see where the edge of the golf course ended, and in the distance where a sleepy neighborhood of houses began. It was a ways away, but it symbolized safety to us, so we slowed down. We walked in tense silence for a while. I looked at Jackie's face and her jaw was clenched, and she looked at me. "That guy." "Yeah?" "What do you think he wanted?" "You know what he wanted." "Yeah, I was hoping you'd say you knew him." And the sound of a car booking it down the road came from behind us. We both turned at the same time to see the man in the red SUV, now on our side of the road and coming straight for us. Neither of us moved. I think we were paralyzed with fear. He jerked to a stop right next to us and began to get out of the car. "Run!" I shouted. We tore down the sidewalk towards the houses. The smiling man started shouting something at us, but I couldn't catch what he was saying, and I wasn't about to turn around and try to find out. The houses were getting closer, but he had gotten back into his SUV and was following us, shouting things out the window. There was a corner coming up, and we heard the SUV stop and then him get out and start running after us. "That way." We turned the corner into the neighborhood, but there was nowhere to go. It was 1 a.m. No one was awake. We didn't know any of the people who lived in these houses, and by the time someone woke up to open the door, he would catch us. But the first house on the street had a low fence. I pointed to it and didn't even have to say a word to her. We both hopped in and stumbled into a stranger's backyard. They had a dog. Luckily it didn't attack us, but unluckily it began barking. We sprinted across the yard and quickly hopped their fence into the neighboring one and hid behind a bush in a temporary pool in the back. The dog in the yard over kept barking. From a hole in the bush, we could see through the wrought iron fence out into the street. Nothing. And then a voice. "I know you're here, girlies." And we could hear him walking around, but we couldn't see him. A gate rustled, and the neighbor's dog barked even louder. He was looking for us in the first yard that we had gone into. He said something else, but we couldn't understand him, and then we didn't hear from him for a long time. A shadow appeared through the iron fence. The neighbor's dog. It had been let out of its backyard, and had wandered past the one we were in. For all we knew, he knew exactly where we were and was playing with us, so we didn't move. We sat silently in the bush for hours. As the night began to fade, and the early morning sun began to frame the edge of the hills, still dark but less so, we heard an engine rev. In horror, we watched the man in the red SUV slowly drive by through the fence in the yard we were hiding in, his face set, turning, searching, and still looking. And in that moment I knew why he had driven away the first time. He was giving us a head start. He was hunting us, and he didn't want the prey to go down too easy. It would have ruined his little game. And we sat in that bush until around 6:30 in the morning, when it was fully light out, and then we ran back to my place to hop in bed before my parents woke up. When we got to the house, I realized we still had all the toilet paper we had stolen from my kitchen cabinets in the bags. Jackie, since we never TP'd Bailey's house, let's TP mine. It has a better tree. Besides, my parents will never suspect it was us, 'cause who the fuck TP's their own house? It was true. The tree outside of my parents' house was a truly magnificent maple tree, and my parents would never guess that we were the culprits. But that's not why I wanted to TP it. I wanted to release all of the tension from the night before and try to relax again. I wanted to pretend that we weren't almost kidnapped in the middle of the night, with no one ever knowing where we were or why we had disappeared out of our beds without a trace. I just wanted to feel like a kid again. So we completely wrapped my enormous tree in toilet paper, throwing roll after roll up and around, and then hosing the entire thing for good measure, so it would be harder to get out and more authentic. We crept up the stairs and fell asleep, exhausted in my bed. Approximately half an hour later, my mom burst into my room screaming about someone TPing our house. And that was the end of our sleep, because my mom was sure that one of our annoying little friends did this. Jackie immediately remembered a mysterious obligation of babysitting for her brothers on a Saturday morning, and she had to go do it or else her mom would get mad. So I was stuck with my irate family combing through wet maple leaves and sopping wet, disgusting toilet paper for the afternoon. I learned 2 lessons that day. Don't TP your own house for obvious reasons, and don't walk anywhere at night. With a friend, alone, to pull a prank, to go on a run. Don't go, because you never know who might be out there waiting for an opportunity to hunt. Hey guys, I've wanted to post on this sub for a long time. Escaping harrowing situations with creeps, sociopaths, and other ne'er-do-wells is something I've had to do many times. This is only my second post ever on Reddit, and the first one got deleted, so please go easy on my old ass. This took place during the late summer of 1993. I was living in Montana, but had a boyfriend in British Columbia, and I often traveled between the two areas. We were broke and carless, so we hitchhiked when we needed to get somewhere further than biking distance. I had spent the month of August with him in BC, and eventually it was time to go back to school. I, of course, not having worked much all summer, had no money. My bum-ass boyfriend hadn't come through with any money for a bus ticket either. My parents were mad at me, so they weren't giving me any money. All my friends were broke, but we didn't have a phone to call them anyway. We were living in a 2-room cabin with no running water in the mountains. The only phone was a party line that belonged to the neighbors, and was basically only for emergencies. The decision was made. I was already 2 days late for school, and I didn't feel like panhandling just for a bus ticket. I had to get back, and couldn't wait for the boyfriend's money to materialize, so it would be my first time hitchhiking alone. I put my backpack's worth of stuff together, made sure I had my ID, because one time we hitched to the border, left Canada, and tried to get into the US before I realized I had left my ID in Canada, meaning I had none to enter the US, but also none to get back. But that's a story for another day. Things went surprisingly smoothly for the majority of the trip. An elderly couple picked me up as soon as I got off the mountain and into town, and took me all the way to Creston, right near the border crossing. I walked across and was picked up almost immediately by a guy who at first gave me the mild creeps, but all he did was lecture me about how dangerous it was to hitchhike alone, and how I reminded him of his young daughter. He took me damn near half the trip. I was actually having phenomenal luck. I walked to just outside the city limits and stuck my thumb out. 1 hour went by, then 2. You're often walking really slowly when you're trying to catch a ride, and eventually I came across a small flap of cardboard. I picked it up, thinking I could walk off at the exit, borrow a marker at a gas station, and make a sign. I thought it might help me get a ride. So I'm walking along a little faster now, and suddenly I see something moving in my peripheral vision. I tense, look, and see that it's a 2-foot thin dark snake trying to get over the cement guardrail to the shoulder. He was never going to make it. He was kind of trying to throw himself over it sideways. I kind of happen to like snakes, and he looked pretty harmless, so I used my sign as a shovel and pitched him over the wall to help him. In hindsight, I should have realized the snake was probably a bad omen. Before I could reach the next exit, a car slowed to a stop. It's always creepy when a car stops and you're walking up to it, trying to judge if it's Ted Bundy or just an eccentric like you. My heart always sank a little when it would be a single man, but I soon realized he wasn't alone. There was a kid in the front seat who looked to be aged 10 to 13. The guy was a little too friendly, but what was he gonna do? Murder me in front of the kid? I was young and very dumb. I decided to get in. The man was pretty chatty, introducing the kid as his nephew. He said they were driving back to where they lived in St. Louis after visiting his brother in Seattle so the kid could visit his grandma. The kid barely even said a word. If I remember, and it's been a very long time, it's about 3 hours to where I lived. He was taking Highway 90 right past the city I lived in, so I was relieved I wouldn't have to get out of the car and thumb it again. The first hour goes by, and it's mostly friendly chit-chat. Lots of family anecdotes and general small talk. The switchblade my BF gave me was cradled in the bottom of my palm the whole time, up my sleeve and out of view, but I began to relax a little. He kept up the friendly chatter, but eventually the questions he was asking took a raunchier turn. Like, did I have a boyfriend? What was he like? What did we like to do, and what was our favorite position? What? I silently panicked, thinking that this guy was a creep after all. My instinct was to play along with his conversation while I tried to figure out what to do. I was pretty sure the drink he had in the console, in a convenience store cup, had more than pop in it, because you could see him physically getting looser as the drive went on. He kept asking gross questions, and I was so embarrassed for his nephew, but still playing along. I just tried to breathe deeply to keep myself from having an anxiety attack, and concentrated on extricating myself from his car. Eventually, he made it clear that he expected me to have sex with him in exchange for the ride. Door-to-door service, he said. Then it got worse. And find one of your girlfriends for my nephew, he said with this hyper-cheerful and menacing smile that made my stomach drop. Yeah, I had to get away from this guy ASAP. At this point, we were about 20 minutes from the town I lived in. I started making stuff up about a phantom hot slutty friend I had, and then it finally hit me what I could do to get away. I put on my best come-hither smile and said to him, "You know what? I bet she's home by now. Let's go straight over to her place when we get to town and get this date started." So I had him get off at my exit and asked if we could get some beer for our first date. In Montana, you could buy beer at gas stations, so I had him stop at a place a few blocks from where I lived. When he somewhat reluctantly went inside to buy beer, which I knew was in the back of the store, I opened my door and sprinted down the alley about a block and dove into a huge clump of bushes. Folded myself up as tight as I could and waited. I still had my knife, but now it was out of my sleeve. I was shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I was afraid it would explode. I tucked my head into my knees and waited, listening for his car to come down the alley. When we had got to the gas station, it was about 4 p.m. in September, so there was still plenty of light. I stayed in those damn bushes until night fell, and then finally I sprinted home. His car never came down the alley, but I could hear him yelling for me, and he sounded pissed. I got in my front door, locked the deadbolt, and collapsed, dirt and little leaves all over me. My roommate asked what had happened to me, and I told her the abbreviated version. She asked me why I hadn't called, and told me she would have picked me up at the border. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave feedback in the comments below, as well as perhaps like, share, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have a personal story that you'd like to submit, or you'd like to just send me a message, links to all of my social media will be in the description for the video below. This includes my Gmail, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the theme of the story is, if it has any, the name of the story, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you're curious at all about the music used in this video, the music is always listed in the description below, in the order which it appears. I also have links to the artists and list the tracks by name, just in case you want to find more of their work. Last but not least, if you have any criticism, please be sure to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Portis Media.
And never had anything bad happen. It was a school night, about 11 p.m., and I was laying in bed waiting to fall asleep. In those days I had a loft bed, which looks like a bunk bed, except instead of a bottom bunk, there was a desk which had my laptop and TV and stuff. It was getting close to summer, so I had my window open to let in the cool air. I was about to fall asleep when my screen fell off my windowsill and crashed onto my bedroom floor. Now this isn't a strange occurrence, because I would often come home and leave through my bedroom window, so the screen did not perfectly fit, due to me taking it off so regularly. So it would periodically fall off, but it did startle me, and it got my blood flowing. So I rolled over in bed and looked up at the ceiling, and thought that I would just put it back in the morning. Then, the pungent, sickly sweet odor wafted into my face. I couldn't exactly put a finger on it, but I thought it was very strange, and should maybe check it out. But slowly, because I was tired, and it was most likely a raccoon that had died under the house. It certainly wouldn't be the first time. So I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes, sat up in bed, and let my legs hang off the side. My heart jumped up into my throat as I saw a large tattooed arm reach through the window and feel around on the floor in my bedroom. The guy grabbed the screen and slowly, quietly pulled it out the window. At this point, I was freaking the hell out, and my adrenaline had kicked in at levels my prepubescent body had never ever before experienced. My eyes started to water. I stopped breathing, and time stopped. I thought it could have been some crazy crackhead coming to kill us and steal our valuables. Seconds ticked by, and I sat there in my bed, not 2 feet away from the window that the arm had just shot through. I thought perhaps he would go away, but of course he did not. To my horror, I watched as the man's arm grabbed my window frame once again. Then he pulled himself up, slowly, and a leg crept through next. It was silent, and had I been asleep, this mountain of a man would have come into my room without a sound, and we would have never have known he were there. But I was not asleep. I grabbed the Bowie knife I kept under my pillow, because I'm just like every other teenage boy, and I yelled at the top of my lungs, "I have a knife, get the hell out of my room." And before the guy could completely pull himself up onto my room from the outside, I scared him. He lost his footing and fell backwards out of the window and into the rosemary bushes outside, cussing and spitting. I remember yelling out for my dad and saying something along the lines of, "Dad, someone's trying to get into the house," and he was at my bedside faster than I could get the words out. He's looking out the window, told me to stay there, and jumped out the window after this smelly ogre. He never did find the guy, but the police came and looked, and eventually they decided it was a drunk homeless guy who was desperate and looking for a place to sleep, and maybe some free food and stuff to pawn. So we locked up the house, fixed my window, and went back to bed for a few hours. I, however, didn't sleep that night. That was an incredibly traumatic experience for me, being that I was essentially the person who had to confront a home intruder. But that isn't the scary part. What was truly horrifying is that a few days later we found a makeshift home underneath our house, with a sleeping bag, water, extra clothes, and a big-ass hatchet. This guy had been living underneath our house for God knows how long, without anyone knowing he was there. I believe he chose to come in through my room, because it was the only room in the house that was open to the outside, that you could not see a sleeping person in it unless he was standing in the room, because the loft bed made it look like it was only a desk from the outside. I still think to this day the dude had planned on robbing us, cased the house, and chose my room as his entry point, because he could get in quietly and he wouldn't wake anyone up. He then built his home under our house and waited for his opportunity. Then when I left my window open, he decided to strike. I've had tons of crazy stuff happen to me in my life, but that series of events that unfolded was easily one of the most messed up things that happened to me, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that crazy messed up things happen to normal people, and you should always hope for the best, but plan for the worst. I've never experienced sleep paralysis in my life until recently. The first time it happened, I wasn't able to move, and I tried my hardest to scream or yell or make some connection to the real world through physical action. I saw a giant pink head floating above me, and I began freaking out. Once I was able to move, I flailed and realized it was just the pink curtains I have above my couch. I sleep on my couch despite having a bed. It's more comfortable for me. The second time it happened, I saw the pink head again, but I realized it was sleep paralysis, and my terror quelled. I've been taking an off-brand of Unicerm recently, because it helps me sleep, and I typically don't dream. I don't take sleeping pills. I usually have vivid and terrible nightmares. I know this isn't healthy, but it helps me. So, the story. I went to New York recently for work. I drove 12 hours there, which went by quickly because of the podcast I was listening to. Work was great, and when it was time to leave, I chose to drive at night to avoid traffic. On my drive home, a tornado watch hit, and the rain began coming down super hard. I was in Pennsylvania at the time, and took an exit saying the Poconos. I don't know if it was the actual mountains, but it did seem mountainous. I pulled into an abandoned gas station parking lot and pulled in towards the back. There were no cars around and the station was chained off. The rain passed, and as it did, I passed out. I had a very vivid dream of running on all fours chasing a horse through the fog, until I lost the horse and instead saw 3 people in hooded robes. They pointed behind me, and when I looked, I was in a house cluttered with antiques and fishing hooks hanging from the ceiling. The only thing I can describe as to what I saw next was a porcelain Picasso painting come to life. It stumbled around the corner, and tried chasing me through the fishhooks. I woke up from the nightmare and was experiencing sleep paralysis in an unfamiliar area, in a state I never go to, alone in my car at 2 a.m. at night, in an abandoned gas station parking lot, just after a heavy thunderstorm. Needless to say, I was petrified. I couldn't move or scream, and I realized my doors were unlocked. I imagine I see a man staring at me through the driver's side window, smiling a cartoonishly big smile. I know that is cliché and a little dumb, but it was horrifying at the time. When I snap out of my sleep paralysis, I look out the driver's side window, and the man is gone. What I saw instead sent chills down my spine. Next to me in this abandoned lot was an SUV parked next to me. It was a very large parking lot, so to park next to me seems odd, even thinking back. There was no one in the SUV. I did a quick scan of the parking lot and saw no one. I checked my clock and was amazed to see that only 30 minutes had passed. I started my car and did a slow roll through the parking lot, desperately hoping I could see someone that the SUV may belong to, but there was no one in sight. I got the hell out of there and merged back onto the interstate, which had no cars on it whatsoever. I have no idea what to make of this. I know that my sleep paralysis demon is inspired by a real object near me. Was this an actual dude looking at me while I was paralyzed? There was definitely a person around at some time, since there was an SUV next to me. I don't think it was paranormal in any way, but was just unfortunate timing. Either way, I really don't want to meet whoever that was again. My dad is the type of man to call bull on anything paranormal. He doesn't believe in ghosts, aliens, or anything of the sort. I tend to follow in his footsteps, and if it were anyone else, I probably wouldn't believe this story. My dad grew up in a poor, small community. My grandparents were incredibly respectful and friendly people, despite the poverty. They made friends with everyone in town and helped anyone that needed a hand. Along came a wealthy but very lonely man, Bill, who moved in next door. Over time, Bill became very close to my family. He revealed that he was estranged from his children after they tried to steal large sums of money from him. He discovered his ex-wife had been having an affair since before they got married and was simply trying to take advantage of his wealth. Needless to say, the type of help this man needed was comfort, not food, not money. Bill was over for almost every meal, and my dad began to see him as an uncle. Just as my grandparents had learned of his family issues, he had noticed that my grandparents were also struggling financially. Since he despised his family, he wrote a will to give all of his assets to my family. Then, Bill passed away due to old age. As you may have expected, his children came around quickly after. They did not host a funeral service or even attend the service my grandparents funded. They were strictly in town for the inheritance. My grandparents desperately needed the cash and knew that the will entitled them to it. But there was one problem. The will was nowhere to be found. Bill hadn't told anyone where he'd left it, and the money would default to kin without it. After extensive searching, my grandparents were on the verge of giving up. The night before the final day to find the will, my dad had an eerie dream. In his dream, He woke up in bed. At the end of his bed stood Bill. Bill proceeded to speak to him and tell him exactly where the will had been left. He told my dad it was in a safe buried in the basement, in the back right-hand corner. He even led my dad to the spot, told him the combination to the safe, and showed him where it was. My dad woke up very startled and ran to tell my grandparents. With little time and nothing to lose, they checked out the spot in the basement. Sure enough, they dug in the right spot, and there was the safe. They entered the combination from the dream. The safe popped open, and the will sat inside. I often write off paranormal stories as lies, misremembered events, or something similar. I checked with all 4 of my uncles and my grandparents for their version of the story, and they all confirmed it. The first thing that several people asked was why someone would bury a will. This is typically something you don't hide. Although my dad never asked Bill directly, he speculates it was due to some mistrust in the banks. This story took place in the mid-70s, and Bill lived through the Depression. My father tells me that the safe contained more than just the will. In addition to a large sum of cash, it also contained contact information for the executor of the will and witnesses. Bill had moved from several states away, and his executor and witnesses were acquaintances from his home state. The people he chose for these roles cannot be beneficiaries of the will, and he didn't socialize with many people outside of my grandparents. Without that information, my grandparents didn't know who to contact about his death from his home estate. After Bill passed, the local court set out a date for recovering the will. Since Bill's local attorney didn't have a copy, they contacted Bill's bank to see if he had a safety deposit box and searched the house. Both proved fruitless, and neither the executor nor any of the witnesses had come forward. The deadline to recover the will was the following day, and that's when my dad's dream occurred. If the will had not been found, the court would have moved to intestacy proceedings. The court would then appoint an executor to distribute Bill's estate to his default heirs based on a state-defined formula. When my grandparents contacted the executors and witnesses, it was discovered that the executors also had a copy of the will and knew of the safe. The executor and witnesses vouched for the authenticity of the original will in the safe, but the legal battle continued. My grandparents didn't mention how the location of the safe was discovered, but they provided various evidence of the poor relationship between Bill and his kids. The kids claimed fraud, but after deliberating, the probate court ruled in my family's favor, and the will remained valid. I still find it odd that Bill would hide the will, but I think it is possible that it was put in the safe as a place to safeguard it, rather than to keep it hidden. Bill may have assumed that his executor would hear about his death right away and be able to provide the location of the safe and a copy of the will. Unfortunately, it took the opening of the safe to contact the executor. Another idea that my dad has is that the location and combination of the safe may have been told to him by Bill in the past, and it was just buried in his subconscious and he dreamt it. I must admit that was my initial thought as well. My dad told me that he never would have had such a serious conversation with an elderly neighbor. My dad was in high school at the time, so the conversations he had with Bill were light-hearted and appropriate for an elderly man speaking to a kid. The serious conversations, such as the one about Bill's kids, only took place between my grandparents and Bill. There is the possibility that my dad overheard a conversation between my grandparents and Bill, but then you'd expect my grandparents to at least remember that Bill had mentioned a safe. If my dad did put the location and combination of the safe from some distant conversation out of his subconscious at the last possible moment, well, what an incredible mind he has. I asked my dad just how much money my grandparents inherited from Bill, but he wasn't sure of the amount. After the probate court ruling, the kids didn't stick around long. They were apparently pretty wealthy themselves, and were half expecting to not receive any inheritance from their dad. They hadn't spoken in years, so I don't think they were surprised by the will. In fact, my grandparents mentioned that Bill told his kids they wouldn't be getting any of his money after they had tried to steal it from him. My dad once told me that when his father passed away, he had put his ashes in the closet because he wasn't ready to spread them yet. Gramps wanted to be spread on our land by a big tree by the lake. My dad said that he must have waited too long, because one night he was asleep, and out of nowhere he woke up to the feeling of two icy hands around his ankles, and before he could freak about that part, those hands jerked his ass about halfway off the bottom of the bed. For some reason he immediately knew it was his father, assuming it was because he was so abusive to my dad when he was a child, and it seemed like something he would do, and he went to spread the ashes the next morning. Never had another issue, although they also don't have any more human ashes in the house. I am currently living in the Middle East. One night, I decided to go mall strolling and watch a movie with a friend of mine. We stayed there for quite a few hours and didn't realize it was already late. We had parted ways. She went home first and I was still waiting for the cab I booked. When the driver came, he was perfectly fine. Nothing sketchy, or so I thought. He was just quite annoying. He was asking too much, asking question upon question. What my name was, where I was originally from, how long was I staying abroad for, where and what was my work, if I have kids or a significant other. It felt inappropriate, so I refused to answer some of them. I just nervously laughed to signal I was getting uncomfortable, but he kept throwing questions at me. I didn't have the heart to tell him to stop asking, or to let him know it was making me feel uncomfortable, so I messaged my friend to call me. We have this safe word we say to each other if we need help exiting from a horrible person, conversation, or situation. And so she called. We were talking already, but he was still murmuring some stuff. A few seconds later, he turned on the radio and put the volume up, loud enough for me to barely understand my friend. This is when I got really scared, and then he began holding my other hand, like that scene from Titanic when Jack was intertwining his fingers with roses. And then, my mind suddenly shut down. I froze and didn't know what to do. And then I finally heard on the other line, "Hello, are you still alive?" I came to my senses and shouted, "Let me go." He said, "No." I told him I was going to call the police if he didn't, and so he stopped and dropped me off somewhere still far from home at 12 a.m. I called my sister to come pick me up. When we reached home, I was so thankful I was alive. For 1 second I thought I was breathing my last set of breaths. So to the cab driver, I don't think I was overreacting, and your gestures were really weird. Not cool. Let's not meet again. First off, for a little backstory, I'm currently 29, and this started when I was 16 or 17. I love watching scary/horror movies, and I've never had them affect my sleep or give me nightmares. Just in case you think that's what caused this. I also have to wear glasses, so you can understand my concern. The night when this occurred, I was going to sleep at around 11 p.m/midnight, with my door slightly open, so that my cat could enter my room. I feel a sense of unease, and look at my alarm clock, and saw it was a little after 12 a.m, and just thought my cat had entered my room. I couldn't see/feel her near me. Then out of nowhere, I can't move, and have a hard time breathing. I'm struggling to turn my head, and I somehow power through, and I can see that my door is halfway open, and there's a red, floating spectre. It's dressed in what I can only tell with my blurred vision, a blood-red, torn, ragged cloak. I'm freaking out, trying to scream, so my brother or mother can come help. But I can't. As I'm struggling to move and scream, it raises its hand out of the cloak and points at me, with a red, skeletal finger. This freaks me out even more, and I can't move at all. Stuck in a position with my head facing this thing, with my blurry vision. It looks like it's speaking, but I can't hear anything. As this thing moves closer to me, I can hear my cat jump from what I'm guessing is my dresser to my bed, and starts hissing at this thing. This thing now retreats and disappears, and I can move. My throat is sore, as if I had been screaming, but no sound had been coming out. I grab my cat, and can feel her tense, and her fur is standing on end. I put her under the covers and hug her tightly, since it appears that she has saved me. I feel comforted by her, and somehow was able to sleep after that. In the morning I checked where the spectre was, and there was no proof it was ever there. I think it was a very vivid dream, and decide not to tell my family. The next night, I don't sleep, and since I drive myself to school for early morning band practice, my mother hasn't seen me in a few days. That day, my best bud saw that I was tired, and asked what was wrong. Since he believed in the supernatural, I tell him, and he believes me, since he knows I'm not the type of person to make this up. He just says, "That's rough," and that was it. I finished high school and community college with a few instances of sleep paralysis every year, but without a spectre. By this time I've researched, and my buddy has helped me deal with this. I make it to my second year into the 4 years at university, and get a place of my own, and I'm roughly 26 at the time. One night, I see the same spectre appear, but I've learnt a few tricks to deal with it. This may sound stupid, but it worked every time. I grew up watching Dragon Ball Z and other anime, and my favourite character is Trunks from Dragon Ball Z. I simply pretended I'm powering up this beam, and have a beam struggle, and screaming like they do in Dragon Ball Z. By doing this, I was able to get rid of the sleep paralysis, and I thought the same thing would work with the spectre. To make a long story short, I win, and ever since, I've never had another instance of sleep paralysis. It all started over a year ago, living in my current small neighborhood. It was unusually hot in our house for October, and my sister figured it would be a good idea to keep her window open for a little bit of air. She was doing her homework, and I was getting ready for bed, when suddenly she bursts into my room. She frantically says that she heard some noises outside, sounds of leaves crunching under a person's steps. I believed it to be an animal, so I walk into her room and stay there for no more than 5 minutes, until I hear leaves crunching. We quickly glance out the window, only to hear the sounds of something running away in the woods. But that would not be the end of the story. During the winter, I would enjoy exploring the woods towards the back of my house, climbing trees and travelling further back into the fields. I remember the events very clearly. It had just snowed that night, first snowfall of winter, and I was more than excited to head out there. I did so and climbed my usual tree to look out. I gave a cursory glance around me, and at the ground when I noticed something strange. Footprints leading away from my house. This wouldn't be weird, as long as the front of the footsteps didn't end pointing straight at my house, and the origin of them came from a seemingly long way off. I tracked them down up to a point where there was a rusty wire fence covered in snow where they disappeared. October 2017. It started again. I was laying in my bed, pitch dark, not a light shining through my room, when I heard it. My doorknob turning, and my door creaking open. My heart stopped. Every single possibility of what it was rushing through my mind. Keep in mind, my door is always shut when I go to sleep. Since I was covered by my blanket, I quickly shot my sister a text. "Did you just come into my room?" She replied, "No, I'm all the way in Hilliard." My heart began pumping fast. I slowly snuck my hand under my pillow and grabbed my baton, sent a text to my dad, and waited. My dad came in mere minutes, with a knife, shot on the lights, and I jumped out of bed. Searched the entire house, with nothing. The alarm was set, and all the doors were locked. It was impossible. There was no way that something had happened. My dad and mum were asleep, and a cat would have opened it much faster if it had jumped at the doorknob. You best believe I didn't sleep a second that night. Fast forward to December. My relatives are in town staying for a week in the basement. We turn on the alarm and all head to sleep. I stayed up gaming. In the morning at around 2:30 to 3 a.m, my uncle slowly opened his eyes with a feeling of being watched. His eyes adjusted to the dark. Before he saw it, a guy of average height, scrawny, hair flowing in the wind, and shivering, looking inside their room through the window. My uncle screamed, and they grabbed the baby before taking off upstairs. That morning I was informed of what had happened. I looked for footprints, and saw only the smallest sign of a footprint. A front toe print made by what I could only assume was a sneaker. My uncle gave me more details without me telling him I looked for footprints, and he said the guy was leaning to the left looking in. The footprints matched his story. The left had a thin line of dirt anyone could have shimmied across. Now that leads to tonight. The night I could swear he, or whatever it was, had been in our house. I couldn't sleep. Life had been very stressful lately, and I was pretty much up all night until I tried getting rest. Every night, I've had string Christmas lights dimly light up the room, until tonight. I figured the lights must have been interfering with my sleep, so I unplugged them and headed off to sleep. Pillow over my head, and I started to drift off, until it happened. A quick strum of my guitar, and the sound of something falling over with a desperate attempt to stop it from hitting the ground, filled the room. This sound ignited my heart rate. Saliva, developing at an extreme speed, made it harder to not swallow. I could feel the presence of someone in my room. Realizing I left my baton on my desk, I did the next logical thing, which was pretend to sleep. I tried, and laid there for what felt like hours, when in reality it was only a few minutes, until I heard a whimper come from my sister's room. Imagining this would be the day everyone in my family was silently murdered, but me, I gathered all the courage I had. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and grabbed my baton. I busted into my sister's room and screamed, "Hey!" only to see they were unharmed. My sister asked what the hell I was doing, and I just stood there, looked into the pitch black of my room, and cried. I've never, ever felt in my life the overwhelming emotion of believing my family was going to be taken from me until today. I sit here in my chair writing this in hopes to document my experience and try to come to some logical conclusion. All that I can come up with is that there was some guy watching my family and perhaps sneaking into our rooms at night. Last year in June, my grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. It was everywhere, even in her eyes. She was fading fast and said to my father, "I'm ready to go. I want to say goodbye to the kids." Panicked, he called his brother and my mother. My parents are separated, and explained to them what was happening, and to bring my cousins and myself there the next day. The next day we visited her in the hospital, spoke for a bit, though it was really hard. That was the last time I ever hugged her and told her how much she meant to me. She died the very next day. I was on the phone with my father when it happened. I could hear the flat line in the background before he swore, hanging up. They tried reviving her, but she wasn't coming back. She was gone. A couple of months later, after the funeral, I was content in my bed, dreaming I was at my aunt's house. But then it changed. I was on the phone talking to someone, but I could see them. It was Grandma. "Are you okay?" she asked me. "I'll see you next month." I woke up confused and told my mother about this. The next day at work on her lunch, my father called her. They were having a memorial to bury my grandparents' ashes in my grandpa's hometown the next month on their wedding anniversary. Here's where it gets even weirder and sadder. That day, as a final personal goodbye, I sang to them the song Southern Cross by Crosby, Stills and Nash, a song my parents sang to me when I was little, that my grandparents sang to me sometimes too. A few days later I was dreaming again, that I was reorganizing my bookshelves and my cell phone went off. I answered it, and it sounded like a party on the other end, and on the other end were Grandma and Grandpa together, telling me they were all right and that they were happy now. In the dream I started crying, and they started singing Southern Cross. They paused only once to ask me to sing with them. That was the last time I ever dreamt about them. When I woke up, I was crying the last of the song's words dying on my lips. I never told anyone except my mother about this. Turns out a few days prior, she'd seen a figure sitting on our couch. A big figure. We think it was Grandma. I like to think they still come and visit every now and then. My family loves traveling. So about a year ago, my family took a trip to France. At this time I'm a 9th grader and in high school. Before the trip, my mum spent a few months learning French, and my sisters had some basic knowledge of the language, so we were set. We flew into some country in Europe, and then took the train all the way to Paris. Once we arrived in the train station, we took a few minutes to prepare ourselves before heading out and looking for a taxi. We were walking when suddenly a guy comes up to us. He knew some English and asked if we were looking for a taxi, since he had a large van taxi. My family was happy. Since we have over a 5-person family, there aren't really enough seats in a regular taxi. So we agreed, and we walked over with him as he points out a large black van with another guy sitting in the driver's seat. Now that I think of it, there's no reason that there are 2 taxi drivers in a car. The weird part was that it had no taxi indicators or anything on the van stating that this was a taxi service. I remember my parents exchanging glances with each other, but going along with it. So at this point we haven't even discussed the price or where we were heading. He just opened the rather large trunk and started chucking our bags inside. At this point, my mum was worried. She demanded an answer on why there was no taxi indicator. The man began switching between English and French and wasn't giving a clear answer. She didn't push it. And my mum then asked for the price. It was a bit costly, but there are no other regular taxi vans around. And at this point, the man is getting the last of our luggage in, when we noticed my dad's attitude change. He seemed more concerned. He went up to the man, stopped him putting the last piece of luggage in the van, and he said, "Show me your taxi license." At this time, I didn't even know there was a taxi license. I guess neither did the man. His eyes widened and he seemed nervous. In very broken English, he said something along the lines of, right, taxi license." He pretended to pat his pockets and acted like he left it at home. My parents at this point quickly grabbed the luggage and said thank you. We didn't need the taxi anymore. They quickly took us across the street and merged us into a large group of people getting away from the black van. We eventually found a taxi terminal and found a large van, and we never spoke of the event again. But I feel like I was that close to finding out whatever these people planned on doing with us. This happened 8 years ago, when I was a 10-year-old girl and my sibling only 7. My parents left us with a nanny because they had to go to a meeting. The nanny, Carla, would leave by 10 after putting us to sleep. And by then, my parents would come back by 12. So there would be 2 hours in which no one would be home except for us. Carla was an 18 to 19-year-old girl, was a very sweet and loving person, but very disorganized. She played with us, cooked, and then watched TV with us. When she had to leave, she tucked us into bed and told us not to open the front door to anyone. Back then, we didn't understand why. Yes, we were idiots, and still are. But we promised her we would do as she asked. She left and made sure to lock the door. Half an hour later, I heard some strange noise. At first, I thought that Carla may have left something and was coming again to pick it up, because that usually happened to her. But then I heard a knock that I knew wasn't her, because she had keys. Being the little rebel I was, I walked to the front door and asked who was there. Then I heard some men whispering and laughing. At this point I was scared, not only because I had disobeyed Carla, but because of the men, and I think I heard 2 or 3 voices who knocked, didn't respond to my question. I didn't know what to do, and just ran to our room, locked the room, and hid under the bed. I didn't wake my little brother, because I didn't want to scare him. The knocking continued for what appeared to be an eternity, and then suddenly stopped. I was still feeling uneasy, so I didn't go to check. Several minutes had passed, and then I thought that they were gone, and we were safe. How delusional. I went to check the front door, and as I was walking, I caught something moving outside through the window. It was pitch black, but when I looked I nearly shat myself. 2 men were climbing up a tree that was as tall as the roof of our house. Then it clicked. They were climbing, because they were trying to get in. There was a small door on the second floor of the house that led to the roof once past the stairs. There my mum had her plants, because they needed a lot of sunlight to grow, but she went only to check on them once a week. So how the hell would they know that you could go inside that way? I still didn't know. The moment I saw that, I ran as fast as I could to our room, locked it as I did before, and put some heavy boxes of toys in case they came. My brother woke up because of the loud noises and asked me what I was doing. I told him to stop it and to go back to sleep. He didn't even care. The front door opened and I heard my parents' voices. I moved the boxes, which took some time, and ran to get them. My parents asked me why I wasn't asleep, and before he had time to scold me, I told him there were people on the roof and that we needed to go. He obviously didn't believe me because he went to check. When he returned, there was no one there, and scolded me and told my mum that I had a very crazy mind. Next morning, as my brother and I went to the kitchen to go get some pancakes, my parents were silent and seemed preoccupied. I asked them what was going on, and my dad pulled me away and told me that 2 of my mum's plants were broken, as if someone had stepped on them. But he still refused to believe me, because he thought I did it on purpose. That day, my dad put in an alarm and some cameras in case someone really did try to break in. I was reprimanded for a week because I had lied, and because I had killed some of my mother's plants. I still can't forgive them for that, and they still refuse to believe me. I tried to forget what I saw, but it's not possible. I still feel shivers down my spine when I think of that night. So to the creepy men who scared me as a child, tried to get into my house, and before that, even knocked on the door, I hope we do meet again, so I can insert some nice plants where the sun doesn't shine. I worked the weekend night shift at a private residence of only 12 residents. They were all autonomous, able-bodied, but they suffered from mental illness that kept them from being fully independent. Super nice bunch of people, and they don't have anything to do with what happened. For context, my mum got me the job at the residence. She worked days during the week and occasionally slept over there at times. When I left, she switched from working the week to weekends working like me. There was a small side of the residence dedicated to the employees, and in that side there was a bedroom with 2 beds. One for the employees and the other one for the boss, who slept there most weeknights. There was a senior cat in the residence, but she had a bad habit of urinating on the employee bed, so we kept the door closed most nights, but sometimes we'd forget. Well, I forgot to close the door one night. The cat peed, so I resorted to borrowing the other bed for the night. It was 3 a.m.-ish, so I couldn't start a load of laundry. I fell asleep fine, but then I had this really weird dream. I was in this private all-girls school, and I was constantly followed by a young 12 to 13-year-old girl in uniform. She didn't speak to me, but she sat next to me in the library or at lunch and would just stare at me. Eventually she grabbed my binder and tried to pry it away from me. I told her she couldn't have it, but she kept on trying to yank it away, becoming increasingly angry and frantic. Then she stopped all at once, looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I guess I have to kill you." And then I woke up entirely paralyzed and unable to breathe. There was a huge pressure on my chest, and I had an impending sense of doom and of being watched. I was facing the wall, so I couldn't turn to see what was going on. The only way I can describe it is having a panic attack while your body is sedated. Eventually I calmed down, and my body started to move. When I looked behind me, there was nothing or no one. I'd never experienced sleep paralysis up until this point, but a quick Google search had reassured me that I wasn't crazy. When I slept in the other bed, everything was fine. I didn't have the same dreams, woke up fine, etc. Here's where my mind boggles. I've had to sleep in the other bed a handful of times over the years I've worked there, and each of those times I've had a variation of the same dream. The same girl, same expression. It was so unsettling. By the third dream, I started becoming lucid, where I would recognize her from my other dreams and start trying to appease her. She'd take my pencil. I'd let her, and I'd try everything not to anger her. But in the end, she'd always end up saying that she was going to kill me, and I would wake up with sleep paralysis and this sense of impending doom/being watched. What scared me the most was the time where I would wake up, but I would still hear her scream or laugh. But I am willing to swear my life that I was awake. I don't know how to explain it, but by the time the sleep paralysis wore off, or I forced myself out of it, it was quiet again. It never happened anywhere else, not in the other bed, not at home, not anywhere. This isn't the main reason I left the job, but in the back of my mind, staying the nights was really anxiety-inducing. It was always that bed, and it still baffles me to this day. Part of me is morbidly fascinated and trying to find a psychological explanation for it, and the other part of me wonders if it was something more. For reference, I'm from Australia, female, and at the time I was about 15 or so. This story starts with me as a teenager, living at home with my mum, stepdad, Richard, and 4 siblings. Back in those days, and having 3 brothers, I was a pretty hardcore gamer. My mum was a pretty heavy sleeper since she was working full-time and caring for my stepdad, who had stage 4 testicular cancer. So I'd spend most of my nights staying up late, gaming. One particular night, at about 2 a.m., I could hear someone walking around the backyard. You know, that crunching of grass, the slight shuffle of boots on concrete. The fact that the family dog Sammy wasn't barking led me to believe that it was just my stepdad. My stepdad often walked around the backyard at night to help with his restless leg syndrome that was caused by the chemo, as the restless legs would keep Mum awake, so he had to try and walk it off so that she could get some much-needed rest. So as far as I was concerned, nothing was out of the ordinary, and I gamed on. Quite a bit later, I heard some noises in the kitchen, but I assumed it was just my stepdad taking painkillers or making a sandwich, which was pretty normal, so I naturally ignored it and gamed on. I eventually went to bed, and when I got up in the morning, Mum was on the phone looking very shaken, and she motioned for me to sit down at the table. I was pretty groggy and out of it, but I started to feel a bit panicked. Mum was meant to be at work. She rarely had days off, even when she was sick, because she had 5 kids and 1 very sick husband to take care of. Finally, she gets off the phone and sits down. Mum tells me that during the night, someone was in her room. She said that she thought it was my stepdad at first, and the conversation went something like this. "What are you doing?" As she could see someone near her chest of drawers where her jewellery box was. "Nothing. Go back to sleep." "Richard, is that you?" "Yes. Go back to sleep." She was pretty out of it because she was half asleep, but she remembered that something about the whole exchange didn't feel right. She said it didn't even sound like my stepdad speaking, and that she'd woken up because she heard something drop to the ground. She didn't think too much about it at the time because of how tired she was, so she rolled over and went back to sleep. In the morning, when she got up, she saw that her jewellery box was on the ground, and a few pieces of jewellery were missing, including priceless family heirlooms that were willed to her by her late grandmother. She went to the kitchen and saw that her phone and my stepdad's phones were missing. So, using the landline, she calls the police, and we later on learn the rest of the story. Our backyard faces a communal nature walk type thing. A man climbed our fence. There's a gate, but we always keep it padlocked, and walked around the house checking all the doors to get inside, which is why I could hear all that shuffling and scuffling outside. We later learnt that my younger sister had snuck the family dog into her bed that night, which is why Sammy didn't bark at the intruder. My mum's bedroom had a sliding door into the backyard, but she never locked it because she didn't see the point. The man had gotten inside through that door and must have noticed the jewellery box. It was obviously very dark, and he dropped it as he went to pick it up, thus waking Mum. Once they'd had their little convo, and Mum had gone back to sleep, he went into the kitchen and started looking for anything of value. He found the phones, pocketed them, and promptly left through the laundry door and over the fence. My stepdad had actually chosen that night of all nights to take a late-night stroll through the neighbourhood to clear his head and help with his restless legs. He'd gotten back after everything had happened, and was none the wiser until the morning. The police told us that we weren't the only people whose houses were invaded that night. Apparently 4 other houses had been hit, and that there was a huge priority on finding the perpetrator. And funnily enough, Mum's and Stepdad's phone were both found in someone else's house, so thankfully they got their phones back a few days later. A few weeks after this whole ordeal, we learned that the intruder had been found. Sadly, he'd sold the family heirlooms for drug money. The dude was just a scummy meth head, but he had a gun in his possession, and it was just lucky that no one was harmed with it. He was, eventually, sent to prison. I live in Chicago, and don't have a car since public transportation is so much easier. I went to a gig at some bar. After it was done, I headed home. My friends and I were all taking different rail lines home, so we said goodbye and parted ways. After walking for a bit, I realized how late it was, and it hit me that the bus I was taking wasn't a late night bus and didn't run past midnight. So I saw a taxi go by with its lights on, and I'd just gotten paid. So I thought, what the heck? I usually don't take taxis because they're so expensive, but I was tired and wanted to get home. The guy stopped without waving my hand, which I thought was weird, but he probably saw me and thought I needed a ride, right? I hop in and he asks me where I'm going. I tell him my neighborhood and he heads in that direction. I also didn't tell him where I lived exactly, but gave him the main intersection closest to me. As we started getting closer, he starts asking about my tattoos and piercings. Whatever, I get asked a lot about them, so I just said where I got them done. He then asks me if I have my more discreet areas pierced, and I tell him no, and asks me if I want to get a drink with him. I inform him I have a boyfriend, and he begins begging me. By this point, we're about to pull up to the intersection near my apartment, and I basically tell him no thanks, but thanks, and then he pulls over in a parking lot and won't unlock the door. I look at him and he says, "The only way you're getting out of here is if we grab a drink." Then he gives me a sinister smirk. I'm practically crapping myself at this point. I'm freaking out and my phone's dead, so I couldn't even call anyone. I don't know how I thought of this, but I said, "Okay, we can grab some beer and hang at my place." I tell him to pull into a 7-Eleven and I can buy us the beer. I get out and tell him that I'll be right back. He watched me the whole time I walked through the parking lot. I go in and act as if I'm asking the cashier to open the cooler for me. But instead, I'm saying, "Hey, this taxi driver is crazy. Help me. I live not too far from this 7-Eleven, and I know this cashier by name." He takes me into the back and walks me out the back door and walks me to the back alley away from my apartment. And then has one of his co-workers keep an eye on the guy until I get back safely. I got home, thanked the cashier a million times, and he said he was happy to help and told me to keep my door locked and that he'd try to get the guy's license plate number. The dude left by the time the cashier got back though, and I haven't taken a cab since and don't plan to again. From pretty much the first night after my dad passed away, I started seeing him in my dreams. I didn't think anything of it at first, because I figured that's a perfectly reasonable subconscious response to losing a loved one. The weird thing though, was that he looked seriously real. Everything else in my dream would have that strange cartoonish vibe to it. Yet, I could look at my dad and count the individual hairs on his moustache and on his head. In one of the dreams, I became lucid and realized I was asleep. I asked my dad point blank, "Are you visiting me? Or is this just a figment of my imagination? I need to know." He smiled, hugged me and said, "I'm here with you right now, son, and I always will be. I love you." I woke up suddenly, and as I did, I saw a very light shadow. Had it not moved, I wouldn't have seen it. It was a head and shoulders leaning through the doorway and into my room. As soon as I saw it, it quickly moved away and backed out of the room. Somehow, it was calming rather than scary. It was absolutely amazing, because that's exactly what my dad used to do when I was little, when he left really early for work. He'd pop his head in and say goodbye. The way this shadow moved was exactly the same, and I'm convinced it was him checking in on me. If that wasn't strange enough, my mum called me downstairs that same morning. She tells me to go into the living room, and I look at the floor. I go in, and guess what? Dad's reading glasses had somehow ended up slap bang in the middle of the room. That 110% confirmed it for me. I was out in the middle of nowhere, camping with my dog. We do this whenever we can. Not a park or campground, just walk through the woods among the trails, pipelines and old access roads. Find a nice place to settle down and set up camp. I spend my time building a fire ring, obtaining wood from fallen trees, and setting up a tent for us, while he runs around telling porcupines he wants to be their new best friend, and chasing them off like deer, like they're there to steal his supper. This past summer, night falls, and we retire to the confines of our tent. I read a bit. He turns circles until he remembers he won't actually ever get comfortable out there, so then he settles in against my leg. When you sleep outside, you don't sleep straight though. I don't. I wake up every 30 minutes. It doesn't bother me. It's part of our reptile brain. Something says, this isn't as protected as it needs to be. No big deal. It's part of the experience. Why I sleep through it all anyway. When you have these periodic moments of presence. I'd rather be here than anywhere, and I'm here right now. It's nice. It's still. It's 3 a.m. and I'm dozing when suddenly I'm awoken. Something is wrong, and I can sense it with every part of my being. My first instinct is to protect the dog. There must be an animal outside, and a canine's nature is to defend. He'll hurt himself to protect me, and I have to stop that from happening. But then I realize this is not an animal threat. This is more sinister. My eyes have remained closed throughout all of this, because these thoughts occur in mere seconds. I open my eyes, knowing that if there were an animal close, he'd have been up and moving before me. That's how nature works. So, no, there is a bigger problem. Someone must be out there and his intent is not benevolent. In that moment, I try to move, but can't. I'm paralyzed. How? By what? I feel it roll through me like a wave of electricity, down my legs, up my chest, sparks flowing across my arms. Then I realize what's happening. I'm not breathing. I don't actually mentally make the connection. Instead, my body constricts and I find myself suddenly gulping air. You don't think about breathing unless you're actually thinking about it. My father passed away in 2016, and I had been struggling with depression, other issues, my path in life, and trying to figure everything out for myself. I was 22, and probably the only person in my family that was mentally prepared for what had happened. I'm not really a religious person, and had no higher power to pray to, and no elders left in my line of life to ask for advice. One night, I was exhausted and completely drained of all my energy, so I decided to call it a night early and go to sleep. Exhausted, I don't remember going to sleep. I found myself waking in the hallway of his old house, right next to his room. This is the room I sleep in now. I swung the door open, and to my surprise, it wasn't my stuff around the room. It was his, but it was all different in some way, like it had been crafted perfectly. He was sitting on his bed watching an old Western movie, one I'd never seen, and I did my best to watch them all with him, so I wasn't sure how I didn't know this one. He was laughing and having a good time. The room was really bright. It hurt my eyes to look at everything. I was so confused. I did what I always did and went and sat across from him under his bedroom window. He always had an extra armchair for anyone who could come over and to have a conversation with him. All of my siblings' friends grew up in a rough spot, so everyone came to him for fatherly advice, because he always knew just what to say. I stared at the TV trying to recognize the movie. I couldn't. I heard children laughing outside his window. I turned to look out, and I couldn't see anything. I was blinded by a radiant, warm white light. He stopped laughing and looked at me and said, "You can't see it, because it's not your time yet. But no, it's beautiful, kiddo." I broke down crying, and asked him where I was and why I was with him. He said, "I brought you here because I know you're struggling, and you need to know for sure." He looked so different from when I'd seen him in his final days. He was warm, happy, and healthy. Healthy like I'd never seen him before in my life. Puzzled and sobbing, I looked at him and asked him, "What should I do with my life? What should I focus on?" He told me, "You need to focus on yourself and do right by your lonesome first." I understood, nodding at him. We talked for a bit about life, and then he looked away from his movie. "Why don't you get us something from the corner store like old times?" I wiped the snot from my nose and the tears from my face, and said I would be back with the junk I could carry. I happily jumped out and walked out of the room and into the doorway. He said, "Don't look back. Just keep walking forwards till you head outside, but make sure you close the door all the way." Confused, I did what was commanded, and shut his bedroom door and started walking down the hallway of his old place. Confused, I could still hear him talking, echoing through the hallway. "Keep walking, You'll make it back just fine." It was getting darker and darker as I reached the front door, excited for candy and junk food with my pops, just like when I was a kid. I sprung the front door open, only to be blinded by the same white light I couldn't see. I immediately awoke, gasping for air and crying. I attempted to get out of bed and got tangled in the blankets and fell, still crying and freaked out by what had just happened. I quickly ran to the shower and took all my clothes off and hopped in and turned the hot water on. I was trying my best to compose myself and stop crying. My body was flush with emotions. I stayed in the shower for a while, trying to get a grip on everything. Eventually I got out and went back into my room, that was once his, to get dressed. Out of the corner of my eye I spotted his old radio. I never really listened to the radio much. I'd been a huge punk rock fan and kept my own genres. I decided to turn it on, and as soon as I did, Simple Man by Lynyrd Skynyrd came on, and I had never heard this song before that moment in time, and it messed me up royally. I instinctively started crying again once I heard the lyrics. My old man was finishing our talk through music, the kind of music he liked to listen to. Since that day, I've done my hardest and put myself out there in the thick of it. I've asked one of my friends out, and he said yes. We've been dating for a few months, and it's looking really good. I took up leather crafting as a hobby, and really enjoyed it. I also got a raise that's almost doubling my pay, and I get to relocate to a new city soon. Someplace I've never been, and I've been listening to all kind of music I wouldn't have thought twice about listening to before, along with saving for a new hobby, the cello. Since then, I haven't questioned the spirit world. It exists. I was there. I know some people don't believe in gods, and I'm one of them. But I know what world exists, and it's one with our own. Last year, we had a student in my grade at high school die in a car accident with his mother. I'd never heard of him or met him. I didn't know until school the next day. That day, I woke up exactly an hour before my alarm, and I saw a shadow in front, blocking my digital alarm clock. I blinked and he was gone. Then in the hallway I heard a loud and very panicked, "Mummy?" School was silent, and they did an announcement explaining what had happened. I went out of class, sobbing, and I felt like it was affecting me, more than it should have, especially since I didn't know him. But when I told others about it a week later, as I didn't want to throw salt on an open wound, they didn't question me. I don't know if his spirit was going to different places searching for his mother's spirit, or if he only appeared to people who could be considered mediums. This happened to me a second time too, although it was before this. I had a cousin who lived in North Dakota, and it was blizzarding. He got in a car crash, and the other car that killed him was actually his brother. Of course, it wasn't intentional. Because of the blizzard, neither of them could really see. But it made the situation even more traumatic for my family. It had been literally years since his death. I had a very vivid dream of him in my mum's room, talking to her. He looked like he had aged, like the age he would have been had he not died. I was a little girl again, acting the way I always did to try and impress him. He told me he was there to babysit me, and I was so happy he was there. When I awoke, I cried, because the last thing I said to him all those years ago was that I hated him. I felt like he turned up to tell me that he forgave me. I told my mum, and she cried too. That day I had the dream was his brother's birthday. His brother just moved to the same state as me, and I'm convinced his spirit was coming down from North Dakota to go with his brother, and stopped by with me to tell me he forgave me. This happened 5 years ago, 2 weeks before my 15th birthday. My family, parents and younger brother and I, had just moved into a relative's house since ours was being remodeled and repainted. It was just a matter of 1 month, but my brother and I were still pretty excited to be moving to a new house. The day we moved, our parents had to go to a friend's birthday party, but since it was a school night, my brother and I stayed home and had pizza for dinner. When the clock hit our bedtime, we went to bed almost immediately, as our parents are pretty strict about curfews. I should mention that in our new house, we were sharing this room that had a single bed in the corner and a mattress that we got from our old place on the floor, parallel to the door. I got the bed and my brother slept on the floor. We switched off all the lights save the night light and went to bed. But instead of sleeping, just started chatting, as we hadn't shared a room in forever. While we spoke, I felt like I heard something downstairs a few times, but I wasn't sure. I was certain that it wasn't my parents though. My mum had a habit of coming into our rooms to ensure we were asleep every time my parents came back home from another outing at night. So I asked my brother if he had heard anything, and naturally he told me I was a moron and flipped me off. I didn't hear anything anymore, so I went to sleep. Right when I was about to drift off, I felt something crawl into bed with me. Something that was shaking like a leaf in a tornado. I almost screamed, but soon realized it was my brother. He wasn't shaking, he was crying. He told me there was someone outside our door. I didn't even think he was joking. He was too shaken up to do that, and I could see tears on his cheeks thanks to the nightlight. I almost immediately realized that he must have seen someone through the gap between the door and the floor, as his bed was placed such that if he laid on his side, he was facing the door. I stood absolutely still for 10 seconds, whispered to my brother to hide under the bed, moved very slowly towards the door without making any noise, and deadbolted it. Despite my best efforts, I did make a loud clunk noise, and not a second later, I swear I saw the knob turn, and with great force too. The person tried the knob a few more times, then started banging the door, not saying a single word. The whole time I was leaning against the door, scared that it would give in if the person was like super strong. Looking back, I realized that wasn't possible. Anyway, this guy banged on our door for 10 minutes straight, and I joined my brother in his crying, and quite audibly so. Now that I think about it, what I mean is they must have definitely realized we were just kids. When the banging stopped, we heard the person run downstairs, but neither my brother or I dared to move an inch. We didn't have cell phones in our room either, and I sure as hell wasn't going to go down to check if it was safe. When my parents finally did get home, they started shouting at us because the front door was left wide open. Only when they came into our door and we heard their voices individually, confirming that they were indeed our parents, did we open the door. The police were called. They checked the house and made sure it was safe for us. What was weird was that nothing valuable was missing. Everything from my dad's work laptop to our PlayStation was untouched. I don't think they ever did catch the person, because we never got a call from the police. Whoever the psycho was, let's not meet again. I am a person that has had paranormal experiences for a long time. I hear things and see things from time to time. Most of my encounters had to do with what most people will call shadow people. I've seen them since I was around 13 or 12. But that's a different story. This has nothing to do with what I've experienced before. This scares me even more. It started when I moved. I was very excited the first place I came to see. It was huge, and there was a ton of space for me to put all my stuffed animals and art supplies. When we settled in, we agreed that me and my sister would live upstairs in the attic. The house has 2 floors and a basement. People live downstairs in the basement, and we got to keep the upstairs and downstairs. I loved my new room. It was like having a new mini apartment all to myself. But the attic had this small dark room near where we sleep that is to keep all the stuff to do with the air conditioner and the vents in the room. That small room always made me feel uncomfortable and just made me extremely afraid. I thought it was just because it was so dark, and I'm afraid of the dark, but I don't think that's the case anymore. I kept having these reoccurring dreams where I see a kid or a small person in my room walking near me. I can never see him clearly though. I always wake up with sleep paralysis. The first time I had this dream, I was so scared, I went crying to my parents. Something I literally never do since I'm 17, and not the type to cry in front of them. Anyway, the first dream was weird. It started with my boyfriend pissing me off after talking to these 2 girls. Then I ran to the church, had dinner with my grandmother, who passed away when I was 9, and her friends. It was a pretty nice dream at first, without the getting angry part, of course, but I loved dreaming with her. After eating, I think I told her I was going to sleep, and when I went to bed, I went to sleep and felt someone in my face. I couldn't open my eyes as hard as I tried. I was trying to scream so that my sister could hear me, but nothing. From slits I managed to slightly open, I could see it was laughing at me. Laughing because I was unable to move. Laughing at me struggling. I was terrified. I stayed awake crying for an hour alone, until I decided to call my mum. Lately, I haven't felt safe at home. I'm not the most religious, though I do believe in a higher power. I have crosses in my room and rosaries as well. I pray sometimes, but I suppose it's not enough. All I know is that I'm so tired, and I know I won't be able to sleep tonight. In June 2016, someone I hardly knew passed away, weirdly at 2 a.m, which was the time she was shot. I had a terribly strange feeling. I couldn't sleep or calm down. I had no idea who she was or anything. I'd only seen her once. The next day I found out she'd passed. I remember thinking, her name is so familiar, and her death suddenly affected me greatly. For a while after that, I saw her in my dreams. I heard some knocking at the door late at night, but no one was there. My dog looked at the door before the knocking ever happened, but there was no person or animals in sight. Now this is where it gets weird. I went for a jog at midnight to a Catholic school down my block where I pray at a statuette. I prayed for her and my normal prayer. I wanted to continue running, but my dog randomly started limping, so instead, I returned home and went into my yard. I was sitting there. No one moved. But my neighbour's outdoor light randomly turned on when I was thinking about her. The next day, I found out that someone was shot at 12:30 a.m, at the exact spot I would have been if I'd have continued my jog. This happened the day after she passed, when it was starting to greatly affect me. I had a dream I was at the location she was shot at, and I was looking for her in a panic. When I saw her, she was wearing the same outfit she passed in. I told her, "You need to get out of here. Someone is coming with a gun to kill you." She hugged me and said, "I know. Don't worry. Everything will be okay." I said, "How would everything be okay?" And I think she just said, "Don't worry. You'll see." But I can't remember that part clearly. This was so long ago. I can't remember every dream, but I just remembered this one. I woke up early one morning. I was half asleep on my bed, and I was worried about something I couldn't remember what. I remember, and I wasn't fully asleep, but my eyes were closing, and I remember she sat on my bed and placed her hands on my arm. She sang, "Just close your eyes. The sun is going down. You'll be alright. No one can hurt you. Come morning light, you and I will be safe and sound." If that song sounds familiar to you, it's because Taylor Swift sang it. The only weird part is that I'd never heard it before. That night, I was on YouTube and found a video of the girl who passed popped up. It was a cover of her singing that song, and the last dream I remember related back to that song. For some reason, I was worrying about the afterlife and what would happen. Before I went to sleep, I prayed for some sort of sign. In my dream, there was a bright light, and I heard someone sing, "And I know you'll take my hand and come to where I am, here where no one can hurt you, here where no one can hurt you, and I know you'll see the light and come to where I am." When I woke up, I searched those lyrics to see if it was maybe a song I heard her cover of Safe and Sound mentioned previously popped up, but those aren't the lyrics. I know this all sounds crazy, but it's true. At the time this happened, I was being stalked, and I would often have a bad feeling when coming home to my apartment alone. Things would just be different. I've been legitimately OCD for a long time now, and things have to be just right, like the placement of things and such. So when they're not, I notice. So that was happening to me. I would find things out of place, like drawers slightly open, or the microwave door open. Once I came home to the shoelaces of a pair of my shoes tied, like someone had just pulled them off without untying them. But I never did that. A few articles of clothing went missing around this time as well. Not enough that I thought for sure something sinister was going on, but the timing did have me suspicious for a while. It was usually stuff I didn't wear a lot, but then suddenly I wouldn't be able to find it in my closet. Once I came home to the bathroom door closed, but I always left it open. It was pretty scary opening the door, let me tell you, but no one was there. I was going through a lot at the time and thought I was going crazy. But then I came home to find the door not only unlocked, but also slightly open. I'm like you. I always lock my door and make sure it is before I leave. I even lock it when I'm home. There was no way I would have left the door unlocked and open, especially when I knew someone was stalking me. I went around my apartment with a knife while on the phone with a friend, but nothing was missing as far as I could tell. The only thing slightly weird at the time was a book on my shelf was pulled out of place just a little bit, which wasn't something I would normally do either. But maybe I just hadn't noticed it or something. I told my then landlord, but as I was moving soon anyway, they waited to change the locks. Luckily, nothing else ever happened, but for a while I was really scared. I think you're right to be concerned and have to call the police. Luckily, nothing else ever happened, but for a while, it was really scary. If you think this is happening to you, you have the right to be concerned and call the police. Call your landlord, change your locks, and see that your security system provides you with some security, as well as some peace. This was during my high school days. I'm Australian. High school includes years 11 and 12, which is our college for anyone from the US. I can't remember the exact year, but I'd say this happened in 03 or 04. Like many kids at my school, I caught the bus home. Beyond it being an atrocious experience, because of it being a bunch of shitty all-male private school kids in a small space, as the public transport in my city is awful. This bus took me fairly close to my house, but I had to walk a bit, all up steep hills because I lived on a big hill. Having walked the usual distance, and now I remember it must have been 04 because I had my laptop with me, I get to my driveway and walk down. The street is literally higher on the hill than the roof of my old house, and our driveway was a rather steep downhill, to some further steps down, to the little courtyard-looking thing where our double front doors were. If you were standing looking at the front doors to your right, there would be another door with a side room that was used by the previous owners as an office. Anyway, I hadn't really paid attention to the front doors since I went in via the side one. I had my overladen school bag on my back and my shoulders slung. Heavy laptop as well. The door's hinges are on the left, and it's inwards opening, and the entrance to the office ends up being obscured by the doors as it opens. So imagine my surprise when, having opened the door, walked in and closed it behind me. Do I see a tall, creepy, meth head looking guy in brown jacket and grey jeans, scrawny, tall and gaunt. He's looking directly at me. But this guy wasn't angry or anything like that. He was surprised as hell. Totally wasn't expecting a 16-year-old school kid to walk through the door. Now my thought process was literally, oh, my mum must be home, and she's getting this guy to do some quotes for some renovations. No problem. So what do I say? Hey, who are you? This seems to snap the guy out of his surprised stare, and he goes for what I've now told myself and everyone was a fake firearm, but I honestly couldn't be certain, even now. The weird thing is, this doesn't faze me at all, and at this point I've realized what's going on. He points this might be a gun at me and starts telling me to back up. I'm weird, completely calm, and I'm staring at this guy, determined to get as much detail as possible in my mind. On the wall closest to the driveway is a sofa bed, in its sofa form, which the guy is telling me to back up to. But he finally catches on that my staring isn't fear, and he realizes that I'm studying him like a damn hawk. So he starts telling me to put my head down. Well, I do, right quickly, because it may be a real gun, and calm or not, I don't want to be shot. He hasn't moved from his spot in the hallway outside the room, and at this point, when I reach the couch, he tells me to sit, and I put myself face down onto the cushions. I do so awkwardly, because I have my school bags on, and then I hear the front door slam. This guy has piss bolted. I dropped my bags and run to the door, yanking it open. Who needs handles when deadbolts and everything have been sheared off by whatever they did to get in? With no regard for my personal safety, in the hopes that I can get a better look of him and see where he's heading. But he was fast, because by the time I got there, all I saw was him running off at the top of the driveway. I grabbed the phone, called the police, and then my mum. Hilarious conversation along the lines of, "Mum, don't freak out, okay? There's been a robbery at our house and I walked in on it." My mum beats the cops to the house. But while they're travelling, I survey the damage. My room had been torn apart by these pricks, looking for whatever they could sell. The cupboard under the stairs, whose entrance was in my room, had been looted for luggage to put the stolen goods in. The office I had the encounter in had also been looted. They stole my Xbox, as well as a few electronics from my room, including my Game Boy and a broken CD Walkman. Luckily, nothing else had been taken as I interrupted them. They hadn't managed to get upstairs where my mother's jewellery was. You may be wondering why I kept saying they without referring to anyone else. Well, the police came, took a statement, and dusted for prints. They said that the MO was that a group, they weren't sure how many, who had done other robberies previously. The second guy, who I hadn't seen, and because I didn't see a suitcase with the guy pointing a gun at me, was assumed to have been taking a suitcase of loot to their getaway vehicle. So that was fun. I'm still surprised at my total calm manner and quick analytical thinking at the time. I'd never experienced anything similar at all. Never been in any sort of seriously threatening situation. Frankly, I think I got lucky. Had I arrived at any later point, there may have been more people there. Or he may have been less willing to run off because he had more loot. Maybe it was a real gun, and if I had been my mother or father instead of a kid, we'd have been dealing with a corpse. I like to think that I looked like a dangerous guy as I scared this gun down, but I doubt I was. This happened to my father when I was a young girl, in the early or mid-90s. My dad was in pretty good shape, about 5'10", and in his mid-40s. He had a fairly high-up government job that frequently took him to Mexico. This particular trip had him working in Mexico City. One night, he and a co-worker went out to dinner in a kind of touristy area I think was called Zona Rosa. They went to a few bars after dinner, enjoyed the city, and decided to take a taxi back to their hotel. When they were in the taxi, it stopped at a red light. There was a police car waiting in line behind them. Suddenly, two men from the street ran up to the taxi, and the driver let them in. They attacked my dad and his friend and demanded their money and jewelry. Now, my dad was pretty strong, so when he started kicking these men, it probably did some damage. That's when the men started stabbing him with rusty screwdrivers they had for weapons. His pants were tattered and bloody from all the wounds. Meanwhile, the police behind them, who had a clear view of what was happening, did absolutely nothing. And the taxi sped off with everyone still inside. The attackers take both of their wallets, watches, and wedding rings. Now the men are angry because there isn't much cash. They drive around the city hitting my dad and his co-worker over and over, while demanding the PIN numbers for their credit cards. My dad's co-worker, who spoke Spanish, kept trying to tell them they didn't have PIN numbers, but this just made them angrier. They had no idea what these men had planned for them, as they just drove them around and around the city. Finally, they stopped in an unfamiliar location next to an 18-wheeler. The men dragged my father and his friend out, and told them to crawl all the way underneath the truck. Then both men jumped back into the taxi and sped away, leaving my dad and his friend stranded in a sketchy part of town with no money. Eventually, they got yet another taxi, and went back to the hotel. My dad immediately packed his things and took the next flight home. I remember him sitting at our kitchen table looking so pale and disheveled. I'd never seen him like that before. His wounds weren't too serious, but he needed a tetanus shot and ended up going to counseling. Despite what happened, my dad didn't let this experience scare him away from going back to Mexico City. He was brave and continued to travel there for work until his retirement. He says that it could have happened to anyone in any city, but it's still one of the scariest things that has happened to my family. Have you ever experienced sleep paralysis? Because I have, and this statement holds more truth than you can possibly know. I have literally changed since my major sleep paralysis episode. I did not believe in evil entities until one got inside of me. Chris, my son, saved me from being taken completely, but the residue is still with me. I think this is the very reason that I'm so angry, mean, and depressed all of the time. I used to be such a positive person, despite everything that happened to me. Now, I'm very, very dark, and medication changes nothing. The dark depression never lifts its hold on me, not even on the brightest of days. Don't think about these things. Sometimes people never experience sleep paralysis until they hear about it from other people. I think opening the mind to suggestion may open a doorway that is better left alone. The only access is through the mind during sleep, the time that we are at our most vulnerable. That being said, there is a documentary on Netflix about sleep paralysis that is very interesting. The Nightmare. Listed under documentaries, it explores the horrors of sleep paralysis and shares the similar stories of different victims, stories eerily similar to my own. This is my story, involving the presence of an evil entity fighting for possession of your soul, is one of the most terrifying situations imaginable. I could not wake up. My son had to shake me awake. When my eyes suddenly flew open in mid-scream, he said my eyes were as black as night. No people, just soulless black empty pools. That, more than anything, made me believe that was more than just another horrible nightmare. I truly believe I would have lost that battle and never woken up had my son not intervened. I lay there soaked in sweat, trembling, heart racing for quite a while afterwards. I have never been the same. As a side note, it was my own fault. I had been joking around talking about selling my soul to the devil in exchange for a better life. It was only me kidding around. I didn't believe in the devil, but feel differently now. But I guess it's not the best to joke around in the supernatural. I was on a website that asked the question, have you ever tried to sell your soul to the devil? I answered sarcastically, well, I offered a few times, but he never showed up. This was yesterday. Last night I had a night terror of a dream so horrible that my brain immediately blocks it from memory upon awakening. All I remember is that I was fighting for my soul with my entire physical and spiritual being, trying to scream myself awake to escape the dream. Chris, my son, heard my cries and came to my rescue. He relayed to me that I was fighting a being of pure evil for the possession of my soul. Wave after wave of horror and evil washed over me, and I was losing. That I had looked into the face of pure evil, and yet had no discernible facial features. I don't remember any of it now. The memories have faded. But I had relayed the entire story to him immediately upon awakening. I do know that my body was still trembling from physical effort and soaked with sweat from the strain. Pretty imaginative for someone that believes true evil only exists in the heart of man. I am grateful that I cannot remember the dream in its entirety, only bits and snatches of the horror that surface from time to time. I'm so grateful that my son heard my cries and rushed to help me escape from a dream from which I could not awaken. This is my mum's experience, not mine. My mum's brother died because a drunk driver ran a red light and hit him, causing a crash. The crash cut his jugular vein, and he died later on the way to the hospital due to excessive blood loss. My mum said a couple of weeks after her brother's funeral, she woke up in bed to him standing at the foot of it. At first, it was just this abnormal bright light. Then it took a human shape, then shifted into her brother. He looked at her and smiled and told her, "Louise, promise me you'll always be a good girl and never give up." My mum replied, "I promise." He said, "I love you." then faded back into this light, and was gone like it never happened. When my mum tells me this story, she always said that it had to be some vivid dream she had. She's a huge skeptic, but I've always awed this in this story. If anyone's wondering, according to my mum, the drunk driver who killed her brother was only charged with a DUI. The guy continued to drive under a DUI suspended license and caused 6 other drunk driving accidents. If I remember correctly, he was the cause of death for 3 people, one of which being a little girl under age 5. The 6th incident killed him. I don't remember how though. How he got away with it for so long, I'll have no clue. My mum said he was the most hated in the town she lived in, and every time he got out of jail, he'd just do the same thing again. It's a shame that so many had to suffer because of his selfish actions. At the time this happened, we moved to our current house that had a big garden. After moving in and being done with furnishing and making the house feel cozy, my parents decided it's time to hire a gardener and do the lawn mowing, cutting of the bushes and stuff like that. I was about 11 at the time and wasn't involved in deciding on a gardener or contacting him, so I didn't know when he would first come. One Saturday dawn, it was very early in the morning, and I awoke to my dog moving around in bed and looking at the window. I was alone in the house since my parents used to work on weekends. My room is on the ground floor, so the window is only about 1.5 meters from the ground. I was still half asleep when I noticed that someone was standing outside my window. His silhouette could be seen through the blinds. I was a bit weirded out, but figured it must be the new gardener, and that he's here really early, because he wants to finish work before the unbearable afternoon heat that we have in summer. I drifted off to sleep, and when I woke up around 10 in the morning, the cops were waiting outside talking to the neighbors. It turned out to be a criminal who climbed through the fence and took a few things from the small storage room that opens to the terrace, like a secateur and some other tools. After that, he stood by my window for a few minutes, watching me sleep through the blind gaps. That's when the upstairs neighbor lady, who was pregnant at the time, headed to the bathroom because of morning sickness, and noticed him standing there. She called the cops immediately, who later spoke to me, and they'd caught the man, saying that he seemed to be very distraught, and his intentions were unclear. I still don't know what he had planned to do, but let's never meet again. 4 nights ago, a long-time family friend died, and yes, it was very much on my mind. I was very sad and could not stop thinking about him. I've got absolutely no idea if this matters, except that I've been thinking about dying, and people who have passed, but who knows, I would be the first one, and it may have just been wished-for thinking. Anyway, 3 nights ago at around 12:30 at night, I was awoken. I thought originally something bad was crushing me, but I had the split-second thought or feeling of evil, and I was absolutely terrified. In fact, terror isn't even close to the sheer horror I was feeling. I had never felt anything remotely like this before, in my dream, or if I was awake. Maybe sleep paralysis, I just didn't know. I tried screaming for help, but of course no voice. Then I tried punching the wall, and it was like moving through water. I was frantic. I tried kicking the wall, but it was the same, like moving through water. Then it stopped, or did I wake up? I just don't know. I was out of breath, and was really, really terrified. 2 nights later, my last night, I was sleeping on my back when I thought I felt someone glide across my upper leg. I nearly screamed and jumped up to turn the light on. God, but nothing was there. After a minute or two, I calmed down and turned off the lights to try and resume my sleep. But there were a lot of really odd noises, just little ones. Strange, but I was trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I fell asleep again, but woke up finally to another horrible snarling, growling, and snapping sound coming from something under the bed. And I felt it come up onto the bed behind my head, something close to my ear, before moving down as if to me again. It was awful. The most powerful, awful sound and feeling, even writing this, makes my heart hurt. I've never ever had anything like this happen to me before. I've had experiences that have always more or less been unexplained, but those experiences have always been good. At least, not in the scary way. My husband is on night shift again tonight, and there's no way I'm sleeping in that same bedroom. I think I'll just stay up. Last night I ran out of the bedroom and watched TV until he got home. At that point, I was still shaken and really thought I wouldn't relive it by telling him anything even then. Last night I ran out of the bedroom and watched TV until he got home. I couldn't even tell him when he asked me why I was up. I said I'd tell him tomorrow. At that time, I was still shaken and really thought I wouldn't relive it by telling him anything. Common sense tells me it's a dream, but God, I'll never forget it. My dad died almost 3 months ago. About 6 weeks after he passed, I had a dream that I was doing laundry and talking to my mum on the phone. I was in our old house that no longer exists, but I was the age I am now and was talking to my mum because I knew she was lonely without my dad there. So in the dream, she has to step away from the phone for a moment, and a few seconds later I hear rustling, and then my dad say, "Hey baby girl, how are you doing?" Still dreaming, I just lost it completely, sobbing and managed to choke out, "I'm okay." And his response was, "I just wanted to let you know that I love you and I miss you." And I responded that I loved him too and missed him too. That was it. A few days later, I finally tell my mum, because every time I thought about it, I started crying. And she said that she also had a dream about my dad, and that she came home and he was just sitting on the couch. She sat beside him and laid her head on his lap, something she never did. It was complicated, but my dad was gay. However, he and my mum were best friends and continued living together even after they separated. My dream was just so incredibly vivid and raw. I understood he was gone, and I have no doubt he stopped by to check in on me. It still hurts, but I'm sure someday I'll be glad to have had this dream. Both of our dreams happening so close just felt like maybe he was checking in on us. This happened 4 years ago, at my then girlfriend's house. She lived out in the sticks of North Carolina, with the neighbors on either side about a half-mile away. Her parents and older brother were home, and for context, we were both 15 at the time. It was around 11 p.m. on a Saturday, and a car pulled into the driveway. The headlights shined through my girlfriend's bedroom window, and we heard a car door shut. My girlfriend and I figured it was a family friend, or someone who was coming to hang out and drink with her parents. We didn't pay it much mind. About 10 minutes later, my ex's father comes into the room looking frantic. He tells us to lock the windows and grab her gun just to be safe. He walked out of the front door, and we sat with her mum and brother in the kitchen. Her dad comes back around 2 minutes later, walks into his bedroom, comes out with a handgun, and walks out the front door again. We had no idea what was going on, but soon we heard her dad yelling. Then he walks back inside saying he took care of the situation. He told us there was a car parked in the driveway with the headlights off and a person in the driver's seat. He said that he reached for the door handle, but the person looked up and whipped it in reverse out of their driveway. However, he thought that there was still someone in the woods because of the car that we'd heard, so he walked back outside with a flashlight and his gun. When he came back in, he told us to lock everything and for all of us to stay in one room. He said that as he was walking around the house, he shined his flashlight into the woods, and there was a trail of reflectors that was stuck to the trees leading from the road to the house. He fired his gun a few times to hopefully scare them away. Thankfully, nothing else happened. It was a nerve-wracking experience nonetheless. Was this someone planning on robbing us? No idea. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out. We all sat and slept in the living room together, and I left the next day. This happened 5 years ago, when I was about 15 and not very smart. I was still in school, and back to then I lived in a small apartment complex with about 4 or 5 apartments in 2 stories, with my mother, brother, and sister. That day, I wanted to go somewhere, and my mum didn't let me. So later that day at about 8 p.m, my mother and brother took my sister to the hospital, as she was feeling a little bit unwell. Me being the rebellious teenager I was, I got dressed and went out. It's appropriate to mention that my apartment was right by a branch off the main street, so the only thing separating the building was a fence. Inside the fence, there were some parked cars and big trees. So I walk out of the house and walk a little further ahead to a taxi stop, and I did. The minute I saw the driver, I was creeped out immediately. He was so creepy and had an unsettling vibe to him. We negotiated on the price, and I tried to bid higher so he could refuse me and leave. When he persisted, I told him I changed my mind and wasn't going. I headed back to my apartment building, and I was surprised when I looked back and he started to follow me. I was scared and began running and hid behind the cars and trees. He literally went behind my tail and into the fenced land and apparently couldn't see me. I could see his feet from under the car and was about to burst into tears when he left and drove off. I didn't go back to my apartment, but I went to my neighbors and had their son accompany me into my house. That night, I cried and was shaking with fear all night long. Looking back now, I realized so many things that could have gone wrong. Him knowing where I lived and going out late at night in a not so safe area, and me being a small 5'2" teenager. That was really dumb on my behalf, but I'm glad that we moved shortly after. It was May 19th of this year, my birthday. Me and my mum were just leaving a music gig from a coffee shop, and my mum decided that she'd rather us take a lift than the bus, because the buses around here are extremely dangerous at night, with all of the drunk people and people with guns who start a fight. We've never had a bad or strange Uber or Lyft experience before this one. Neither of us were expecting this to happen, especially in the part of the city we were in, because it's not the bad side. The lift came, and it didn't come up to the coffee shop, though it kind of parked in the dark street where it was hard to see. We weren't sure why he did that, but whatever. We got in, and everything seemed fine. We thought we were on our way home, but it turns out that we were very close to being taken. We both noticed that he was taking a weird route at first, that turned into him not even going in the direction of our town. Note, the address he put in the GPS was on his phone, and it was our home address, but he wasn't following it. We asked him, "What are you doing? Where are you going? You're supposed to go on the highway." He wouldn't respond, and kept his eyes on the road the whole time. My mum tried to tap him on the shoulder. Nothing. The only thing he said to us the whole ride was, "You're going to Andover, right?" We both simultaneously screamed, "No," and he laughed. But it wasn't just a chuckle in a malicious laugh. He was indeed going to Andover, and that was not the city we put in for the address. It's 30 miles away from where we live. He was getting further and further away from our town, and we began to panic even more. My mum called the police, begging them to send a cop car or to do something to stop this man, and they said, "We can't do anything." "Are you kidding me?" my mum said. "We're being taken somewhere by a stranger, and who knows what his intentions are. The operator must not have been taking my mum seriously or something. The operator just kept saying they couldn't do anything about it, and that was it. But they said to stay on the line until we were safe. What if we never were safe in the end, though? It sounds like they weren't going to do anything unless this man harmed us or said something violent. They didn't care one bit." As we were almost in Andover, the Lyft driver changed his mind and apparently turned the car around and went back to our town. He still wasn't speaking to us. Me and my mum were still scared the whole time, even after we arrived to our house. I'm pretty sure that I saw a firearm sticking out of his pocket. Both me and my mum are very wary about Lyft and Uber, and we take extra precautions now when we use that service. In January 2011, my then boyfriend and I flew to New York City for his 21st birthday. We were both excited. We'd never been overseas before as we're Australian, and were really looking forward to seeing the city. We arrive at JFK around 10:30. We were so exhausted. Our luggage seemed to take forever to get off the carousel. As we were waiting, we listened to the warnings over the loudspeakers that stated we were only to get into the yellow taxi cabs and not get into unmarked cars. We got our luggage and headed for the exits, where there were a few taxis and one guy in a driver's uniform who came up and asked if we wanted a ride. We say yes, and he takes my suitcase and starts heading across the crossing. At this point my stomach drops, because he walked past the taxis and continued into a dark car park across the road. We followed him cautiously, because he has my suitcase, but we start to say we're not interested and want to go back. He stops at a black BMW, and I say to him, "Sorry, but we're going to get a taxi." He turns, looks at me and says, "Don't worry, baby, I'm legit." At this I grabbed my bag, and we noped out of there and into a yellow taxi. The driver said to us, "Yeah, you were either almost mugged, taken, or something worse. You've got to be careful out there. I really hope to never meet anyone like that again." This story takes place a couple of weeks ago, at around 8:50 AM. For the story, you should know that I sleep with a large pillow over my upper body for comfort. This comes in later. I was in bed, sleeping, but not actually sleeping. I was in a state that most of us know to be sleep paralysis, a state where you are temporarily stuck between consciousness and unconsciousness. Basically, you can't move no matter how hard you try. You have only 2 or 3 out of 5 senses, which means you'll be lying there being able to hear and feel, but not be able to smell or taste. As I'm laying there trying to jolt myself awake, I notice that I can't move, but I can hear and feel, which instantly tells me that I'm in sleep paralysis. I slowly start to panic. See, the thing with sleep paralysis is that it's an extremely volatile situation. The more fearful you become, the more intense the experience becomes. So I'm laying there struggling to wake myself, and I'm starting to feel this small but extremely heavy body heave itself onto the lower left side of my mattress around my legs. There aren't any children in my house. At this point, I'm already terrified to no end, and I'm still struggling to wake myself when I feel this thing grab my upper leg. Then, it slowly climbs up towards my upper body and yanks the pillow off me. I instantly jolt awake in a cold sweat, looking frantically around my room, and notice that my pillow is almost on the floor. My heart is racing, and my blood is pounding in my ears. What just happened? What was that? Did it just pull my pillow off me? I sat there trying to calm myself down in an attempt to rationalize things in my head, when I realized there was no way that I could have caused my pillow to slide off me in the sleeping position, even if I tried. For the next few days, I was pretty scared to go back to sleep, in fear that I might slip into another episode of sleep paralysis. I did have another experience, but it didn't last very long. When I was about 12, I got my own room for the first time in my life. I was scared of sleeping alone, as I had shared a room until then, but after about a month, I was fine. One time during summer, it was really late at night, I believe 1 or 2 a.m. I was on my iPod for a while, but decided it was time to go get some sleep, when I laid down and closed my eyes. That's when I felt something touch my leg. It wasn't a hit, but it was enough pressure to know something was definitely touched, and it felt like a dog's paw. Now, my dog was sleeping outside. I jumped out of bed as fast as I could, got my iPad to use the light to see if anything was in my room. After that, I couldn't sleep. Fast forward 5 years, I'm living in another city. I wake up one night with sleep paralysis. I could not talk nor move, and I see a shadowy figure hanging over me. I try to ask if it was my dad, as it was roughly the same size as him, and all I could let out was a whisper. It was like shadowy, how in the movies when the shadows are emanating from the body. I closed my eyes and prayed to God, and it went away. I also had a dream where I saw a shadowy figure, again, that resembled the one I saw with red eyes, and it was asking for my soul. I know it sounds corny, but in my dream, I said no, and it immediately went away. Everything I'm about to tell you is true, and rather banal if you've not experienced sleep paralysis yet. In such a state, it feels as if you're paralyzed yet aware of your surroundings. Many associate this with demonic or dark forces. An array of independent accounts are documented of attacks by unknown mass that sits on one's chest, inducing a feel of suffocation. My paralysis was intermittent, but terrifying each time, except for one. Through the implications of what I've witnessed, have haunted me since. This episode was unique in its serenity. I met someone in college, and later we moved into a small home in a historically haunted old city. While I finished my degree, he was flipping houses, so we already knew where we would reside and had been staying there for many months. The bedroom we slept in was quite small. On my side of the bed was the entrance, and just to the right were double mirror sliding doors for the closet. Just to the right of this, in the very corner of the room, was a chair. This is important later. It was in this room that the phenomenon occurred. I could not move, but was not afraid. I was lying on my side facing the wall. The room wasn't dark, as morning light had begun to reflect off the closet mirrors. In this state, I saw a woman in a white gown cross to the entrance, walk past the mirror, and disappear into the corner with a chair. She was translucent, but otherwise looked normal. The aspect I often struggle to convey is how, when I awoke seconds later, the perspective of my vision, that room in that moment, looked exactly like it did when I was paralyzed. There's no way to prove this even to myself, but it was as if her eyes had never closed. There was this moment between worlds, between states of regular consciousness, and I was there. I sat up, bewildered. I woke up my partner and immediately said, "I saw a woman in white cross in front of the mirror." His response could not have been more shocking. "Oh, that's Mary. I leave a chair there for her." I was in shock. He came from a religious family, and there was nothing that suggested to me he'd ever had any beliefs beyond that. We'd never had a conversation regarding any aspect of the paranormal until that night. He's not the joking type, so I find him to be credible. I still do research from time to time on these old houses. This one was built in 1953, and two of its occupants, a husband and wife, were deceased before we lived there. But that's all I've been able to find out. In conclusion, I now believe I've seen a full-bodied apparition. I've also come to realize how vulnerable we are to various spiritual dimensions during sleep paralysis. And perhaps I was lucky. This realm was innocuous. If you should ever find yourself quite literally stuck to your bed, wiggle your fingers and toes to escape, or stay, if you dare. I am now 25, in middle school, and I became best friends with a boy, James, and a girl, Dee. These kids were my lifeline in a dark time in my life, and I cannot stress enough how much I needed them then. I thought of them as my brother and sister. I thought we would be friends forever. We planned our lives on how we would buy a farmland with 3 houses and live our happy lives. But that wasn't in the cards. James and Dee had a big falling out the first year of high school. I remained friends with both, but James purposely distanced himself from me as high school progressed. James fell in love and married barely out of high school. Senior year 2012, Dee died a violent and premature death in a car crash, and it wrecked me. I mourned for years, memorized her in 2 tattoos, and felt/feel her presence in multiple ways, and feel as if I can call out to her and still reach her. And the song that we last listened to frequently on the radio is When I Think of Her. I dreamed a year or so back of seeing her again. I was 100% in this reality in the dream. I was shocked she wasn't dead, and she offered an excuse as to why she faked her death. We spoke throughout the dream, and caught up on our jobs and lives. She was more mature, more slender, still had the same hair, braces gone, tattooed, now a woman like me, and not forever 17. But I woke up back to reality, and she was still 17 and in an urn. What happened to James shocked me. We were no longer friends, but we kept each other on social media after he added me very shortly before what was to happen. Last year, near Christmas, the healthy 24-year-old suffered his very first seizure and died that night. His young wife left a widow. It seemed to be a complete shock to everyone in his life. It turned out he had an undiagnosed heart condition. I felt immensely sad by his tragic passing, and lost life, but did not attend the funeral, as I felt it wasn't my place. I never felt James's presence, nor have I called out to him, but I did mourn him. The James everyone talks about on his Facebook page is a tall man with a deep voice and a goofy sense of humor. The James I knew was a little boy. The three of us did not feel so little at 12, but from my current perspective we were very little. The James I knew was a kind, hard-working and stand-up boy. Our first interaction before becoming friends in 7th grade was in 6th grade, with him scolding someone and defending me from another kid that was bullying me. Don't make fun of the new girl, then meeting me with a soft smile. He rode his bike 20 to 30 miles around the city of Phoenix to meet Dee and I while we were lazy and took the bus. Leaving my neighborhood to drive to work yesterday, I noticed a familiar bike with features I remember on his bike, like the bars on the back wheel, where his little brother would stand while holding his shoulders to hitch a ride. I think nothing of it, until I notice other features of the rider. A young kid, perhaps 13, with shaggy brown hair, around 3 inches from his shoulders, just like he had in middle school. A baseball cap like the three of us would wear, a baggy t-shirt and jeans like he would wear. And this kid looked at me for a solid second, though I had only moved and glanced at him, and observed that I could not see a figure on this rider that wasn't a childlike version of James. I turned out onto a main road, and he turned and began heading the same way. I got stuck at a light about 2 blocks down, and the kid was still riding in my direction. And at this moment, now he would ride up closer, and I would be able to get a look and see that it wasn't him. I had an intuition that if I looked away he would be gone. I directed my attention to the road and looked back in my rearview mirror, and sure enough, he was no longer visible. I've read about sleep paralysis, and I've had a few experiences, perhaps 4 to 5 in my entire life. But I still remember this one in particular, because I think this was different, and I could see and experience more than I think. It was 2 or 3 a.m., and I was having this traumatic sleep paralysis, the one where you can't feel or move at all, not even your eyeballs, nor any part of your body, and it's terrifying. In just a matter of seconds, I could move my head just a little bit, and luckily, I could turn, and my whole body would move to one side. That was the moment when I saw it. At that moment, I was awake, still confused about this moment, because I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, or if what I was watching was real. Then, I got shocked, because there was this dark figure right next to me, and it was so clear that I could make out a precise description of it. It was humanoid in shape, about 1 meter tall. It was darker than dark itself, and it had this particular thing like a shining nervous system, electrical and barely shining through its body, that really caught my eye a lot. And that creature was observing me, putting his hand on me. But when I could move even more, I moved my arm towards him, trying to touch him somewhat, but my hand passed through him. When that happened, he just left walking, like in slow motion away, and vanished. This was about 7 months ago, but I still remember it as if it were yesterday. There was so much detail that my memory kept, and I'm trying to figure out if it was just my sleep paralysis or something more. After this weird experience, just moments later, I didn't feel afraid anymore, just really curious. When I was younger, I had a lot of trouble sleeping, and would sleepwalk and have terrible night terrors. This happened for about 6 years of my early childhood. For a bit of context, my brothers all lived together in an apartment, or flat as we called them in England, which was only 2 floors and had about 6 people living in them. I don't remember exactly when it started, but I began having incredibly vivid dreams of dead people that were inside my house. From what I can remember, from my pea-sized brain, they wanted to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand. Many times, it would end up in a nightmare for me, and I would sleepwalk. However, I would run and scream up and down the halls like I was being chased by something. When I was awake, I wouldn't be able to walk down the hall by myself because of people I saw hiding inside of the rooms. It got to the point where my mum had a priest over to bless the home, and after a while I stopped seeing stuff, experiencing night terrors, and never slept-walked again. Turns out the apartment block was built on a graveyard. I'm an 18-year-old female, a student, and from where I'm from, July is an exam period for everyone, so I drag my backpack everywhere. It was 7 AM, and my exam was going to start at 9 AM, so I decided to call an Uber and get there early, because I live at least an hour away from the exam center. The car arrives on time, and I go in now, and I'm not the type to judge someone with a glance, but for some reason, the driver of the vehicle made me feel extremely uneasy. He was in his mid-40s. He had dark circles around his eyes and was smirking a lot. He was silent for a good 10 minutes, and then he started asking me questions. He asked if I was a student. I didn't want to answer, thinking he would try to hit on me, so I just lied and told him I was a proctor, hoping that he would back off. God, how wrong I was. He started to smirk and tell me he would always cheat on his exams, that I was a mean person for ruining people's lives. I don't know why I did this, but I chuckled at his comment, and this probably triggered him to thinking I was liking this. My bad. He then started to get personal and asked me how old I was and if I would let my kid cheat. I lied, told him I was 34 and that I had a 16-year-old kid. Mind you, I look pretty damn old, I'm overweight and don't have the best genetics. I hoped this would drive him off since I was old and had a kid, but he got creepier. He then told me I looked like a strict person, and if I had a whip in my backpack. Then he asked if my husband was strict like me, and I told him that he was stricter, hoping to make him sound like a dude who doesn't want to be messed with. That did shut him up for a while, until I noticed he was moving to a completely different region. Now, I'm not a map expert, but I know the exam center could not be reached with that route. I started to panic, but was afraid he would do something if I confronted him, since we were in the middle of a rural area. So I decided I would receive a fake phone call from my coworker and pretended to talk and tell her that I was in the Uber and that we would be there soon. And I shit you not, when he heard it, his car turned around and went in the direction we came from. He continued to make flirty jokes until this happened, and I swear this turned my blood cold. As we were approaching the center, he told me that I should catch someone cheating, come back with him, and let him drive them so he can make extra money after that, and he would take me to my address. The creepy part is that he had studied it by heart. He was looking me into the eyes and made it sound like he knew where I lived. I still remember the mark he drove was a blue Nissan. If I ever need an Uber again and get stuck with a blue Nissan, I'll cancel it no matter what. I didn't call the company because I'm afraid that he'll come after me since he knows my address. I just don't want to be associated with him by anything. So creepy Uber guy, please, let's not meet again. I grew up in a relatively small Midwest town, so when someone went missing, it was big news, and everyone would talk about it. A while back, a 13-year-old girl wound up missing, and it was all people were talking about for a few weeks. We were the same age, just went to different schools, so it hit close to home for me especially. A few days after her disappearance was in the news, I started having these vivid dreams, where I felt that I was living first person in this girl. I never saw what I looked like, I just knew I was her. I would always be in the same dream, where this couple that lived a couple of blocks away from my actual house would drive up and grab me as I was walking and shove me into their car. The dreams were extremely graphic, and I always ended up being thrown into a ditch about a mile away from the house. I would wake up screaming, and it even got to a point where I didn't even want to go to sleep and would pull all-nighters because I was afraid of having the same dream again. The dreaming went on for maybe a week or two, and then it suddenly stopped. A few days after they stopped, the authorities found the missing girl's body, sadly. She was found in the same ditch I dreamt, exactly in the same spot, only a mile from my house. It still kind of creeps me out, and I kind of feel guilty for never telling the authorities about the couple in my dream, or about the ditch where the girl was found. But I genuinely thought they were just nightmares from all the talk in the town, and even after they found her, I didn't want to waste the authorities' time with speculation. I'm normally a pretty skeptical person, but I still can't explain this. When I was in high school, I lived in New York City. I went to a school on the Upper West Side, but I lived in East Midtown. It was a long trek on the subway back to my neighborhood, so every once in a while my parents would let me take a cab. One day, I was feeling particularly awful. I think I ended up coming down with the flu. My parents were forcing me to go to a therapy appointment. We never got along well, and this was their solution. Even though I was sick, I decided to take a cab from school to the office. I was probably about 16. I was never a pretty girl in high school. I usually wore a hoodie and jeans, and I was looking particularly gross this day due to feeling awful, and I know I was snorting all over myself. I got in the cab, and the cab driver started talking to me, which I usually didn't mind that day, but I didn't feel like talking. He asked me some typical stuff, like my name and where I was from. Then he started asking deeper questions. We were only halfway through the ride and I was starting to feel really skeeved out. He asked me if I had a boyfriend. He kept looking at me in the rearview mirror. He then asked me if anyone was waiting for me where I was going. I was feeling really sick at this point and not using my best judgment, so I said no to the boyfriend comment, but was smart enough to say yes to the second. He then asked for my number, and I told him I didn't have a cell phone. And of course, a few minutes later, it rang, and he looked at me with this god-awful smile on his face. I wanted to escape the cab, but I was afraid if I told him to pull over, he'd speed off with me in the cab. We got close to my destination, and we were stuck in some traffic. I told him to let me out here because I was going to be late. He locked the door and refused. I panicked. He was using words like baby and sweetie to refer to me. I should have just called 911, but I didn't think of it in my state of mind. But somehow, he must have decided against whatever he was doing. We reached a corner. He unlocked the doors. I threw money at him and ran out. I didn't even get his plates. I just wanted to get away. I'm 26 now, and so scared to think what actually might have happened. I've read some of the stories on here, and hadn't thought of it in years. Be careful when you get a cab. You never know what could go wrong. I am a sleepwalker and talker. When I get stressed out, I tend to sleepwalk more. But it's a pretty solid thing that my family and roommates are aware of. I've always had bad dreams. I woke up in terror most nights and would scream in my sleep. The most recent bout of sleepwalking has been strange. When things happen, I don't really remember them. At the moment, I'm living with my parents and sister in my family home. So about 3 weeks ago, I apparently rushed out to my mum's as she left for work and slammed on her window. I thought she was stealing her own car. Then 4 days ago, I went into my mother's room and woke her up, asking why she didn't have a nose. When I was younger, I remember an event. I did not think it was real, but last night I found out it was real. I'm from New Zealand, and we have the Maori culture. The weapon of a Maori male warrior is a patu. It's kind of like a clubbed-shaped bone or jade-carved handheld weapon. In my childhood, I distinctly remember walking out of my room and into the kitchen for a glass of water. As I rounded the corner, there was a Maori warrior, complete with flax skirt, full facial tattoos, and a patu, making the dominance gesture, which is poking your tongue out and making an oof sound. I froze and screamed and closed my eyes, and he was gone. I always thought that this was some kind of crazy dream, or my sleepwalking delusion. Last night, me at 30 years of age, I got up and walked through my house into the kitchen, rounded the corner, and what did I see? The same warrior making faces and threatening me. I kind of froze, dropped my cup, and closed my eyes. When I opened them, he was not gone. He had in fact gotten closer to me, making very threatening sounds and looks. I sort of stifled a scream and backed up to the door to the hallway. I opened the door and slammed it and stood behind it. I woke up my sister, and she came out of her room and was yelling at me about making noise while she was asleep. I couldn't form a sentence. I just pointed to the door. She shoves me out the way and opens the door. And wouldn't you know it, the kitchen was empty. I don't know if I was sleepwalking, or if the Maori warrior is part of the spiritual house I live in. When dreams become reality, it will always be scary. Right after my love of my life girlfriend died in an accident, I experienced something I still can't explain. Literally one day after, I was laying in my bed on my back, with my head facing the Polaroid pictures of her that I still had hanging on my wall. I was just dozing off to sleep when I said in my own head, "Janine, I still love you. I miss you. I hope you're here." Right after that, I felt the end of my bed sink down by my right foot, like what happens when someone sits on your bed. Then I could feel what seemed like someone crawling on their hands and knees. I have a very big bed, and they were coming towards me. When whatever was in my bed with me reached me, I felt this weight on my chest like someone was laying on it, with their head right next to mine, just like how my girlfriend used to lay on me. All of this happened with my eyes closed, and I know I was half asleep. So it could have been a dream, but there was something so comforting about this presence, so calming, so soothing, like I'd never been more at peace in my life. Then my dad called me. As soon as the phone rang, the weight immediately lifted off my chest, and the feeling of immense relaxation was gone. That wasn't very long ago, a few months ago actually, so it's all very fresh in my mind. To this day, I still think she was saying goodbye to me, and I have not experienced anything like that day since. I hope I can experience that kind of universal peace again. Okay, so a little backstory first. I lived in Thailand from ages 13 to 17 as a missionary kid. My parents never really let me travel by myself unless it was necessary. We didn't have a car or anything, so I would rely on public transport. Being a young blonde white girl in Thailand, I usually wasn't traveling by myself anyway. On this particular occasion, I was out at a mall with some friends, and I was going to go home. It was around dusk, and so I was going to take a taxi. I've taken taxis before, and haven't had any weird experiences until this time. When I get in, the guy was asking me questions like where I'm from, or what my parents do. They usually ask these sort of things because I speak the language a bit, and they're curious like anyone else would be. But this guy begins asking me very personal questions. How old I am, if I have a boyfriend, if my parents are home. I immediately start to become uncomfortable. I gave him a false name and age, saying that my parents were home, and this is not where it stops. His questions continue. He's now smiling creepily at me in the rearview mirror, and I ignore him and just look out of the window. After a minute of silence, he starts to hum, not just humming to himself, but stares at me from the mirror. I wait a few more minutes and have my phone in my hand ready to call someone if he makes a different turn, as I knew most of the paths to my house, so I would know if he were to take a wrong turn. I also start memorizing his taxi number, colour, and what his face looked like. He eventually starts full-on singing to me a slow song that I couldn't understand. I finally call my parents and just say to stay on the phone with me. The guy realizes I'm on the phone at this point, stops immediately, and doesn't look back for the rest of the trip. I told him to drop me off a block away from my house, just so he wouldn't know where I lived. I've never gotten out of the cab so fast. I realized he could have been harmless and not intending to be creepy, with his singing and his other stuff, but it was weird, and I was not going to take any chances. It was Sunday afternoon, and my boyfriend and I had just got home from a weekend camping trip. We unpacked quickly, and he went to the shower right away before he had to leave for work. I anxiously kept unpacking everything, and hated the fact that I would be alone in the house until around 11 p.m. when he got back home. Our house is old, creepy, and kind of secluded. After he left, it was my turn to shower. I always made sure to shower when it was light outside, so I wouldn't be as paranoid about every noise. I got out of the shower, wrapped my hair in a towel, and threw my house coat on, laying on my bed playing on my phone. Then, I heard the front door handle jiggling loudly. I waited for a moment, and heard the front door jiggle more aggressively. Feeling irritated, I immediately assumed my boyfriend forgot his work keys, house keys, or phone, and had to turn back, meaning he'd be late for work. I got off the bed annoyed, and went to open the door for him. When I got to the door, I saw a strange man staring back at me through the door window. He was holding the door handle and turning it. We made eye contact, and his eyes went wide. He took off running, and I ran to the back door to make sure it was locked. I grabbed my phone and frantically checked every window to see if the man was in the backyard. We don't have any fences, and live in a wooded area. I couldn't see him or find him. At the time, I didn't know if he came, because he knew I was home alone, or if he'd been waiting watching the house and saw it had been empty for the past few days. Either way, I grabbed my car keys, scooped up the dog, and got the hell out of there.